The Montana wind cut it through the compound like a blade forged in the Arctic, carrying with it the scent of pine and something darker, something that tasted like consequence. Colonel James Maddox stood at the observation deck's reinforced glass, watching 40 souls step off the transport trucks into the kind of cold that made men reconsider their life choices. His breath fogged the window, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw his reflection superimposed over the arriving candidates below. 60 years stared back at him, 35 of those years spent in Delta Force, in places where the United States government would swear under oath he'd never been, doing things that would never make it into any after-action report. The remaining years building Maddox Security Solutions from nothing into something that mattered, something that kept diplomats breathing in Kabul and oil executives alive in Caracas. He'd seen 1,000 recruits arrive at compounds like this one, watch them swagger off buses with testosterone and bravado, watch that same swagger leak out of them like hydraulic fluid from a compromised seal within the first 72 hours. Hell Week did that to people. It separated the ones who talked a good game from the ones who could actually play it when the stadium lights came on and the crowd went silent and every eye was watching to see if you'd fold. But today was different, and James knew it in the way a man knows a storm is coming even when the sky is still blue. Today, his daughter was stepping off one of those trucks. 28 years old, Ava Maddox moved through the crowd of candidates with the fluid economy of motion that came from 4 deployments with Marine Force Recon, from firefights in Helmand Province, and close quarters chaos in Syrian border towns that didn't officially exist on any mission brief. She wore the same gray fatigues as everyone else, carried the same 60-pound ruck, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that made James's chest tighten. Pride mixed with a fear so visceral it tasted like copper on the back of his tongue. She looked exactly like Sarah had at that age. Same dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, same sharp jawline, same eyes that didn't ask for permission or forgiveness. Sarah, who'd been gone 5 years now, taken by cancer that spread through her like wildfire through dry timber, giving them barely 6 months from diagnosis to the funeral where James had broken down in front of 200 people and didn't give a damn who saw it. Tommy Castellano's hand landed on James's shoulder, heavy and familiar. 52 years of hard living had carved Tommy's face into something that belonged on Mount Rushmore, all angles and weathered stone. He'd been James's spotter in Mogadishu, his teammate in Tikrit, his best friend through 3 decades of the kind of friendship that didn't need words most of the time. "You good?" Tommy asked, because sometimes you did need words. James didn't answer immediately. Down below, Ava had spotted the observation deck. She didn't wave, didn't acknowledge him at all. Professional to the core, keeping the line between family and duty so sharp you could cut yourself on it. That was Sarah's influence too. Sarah, who'd told him on her deathbed, in a voice ravaged by morphine and tumor pressure, to let their daughter live her own life, fight her own battles, make her own mistakes. Sarah, who'd made him promise. "No," James said finally, "I'm not good, but we're doing this anyway." The briefing room smelled like fresh pine and gun oil, that particular combination that existed only in places where serious people prepared for serious work. James stood at the front, 40 sets of eyes locked on him with varying degrees of attention. Some were already flagging, the altitude and cold and weight of their gear pulling at them like invisible hands. Others sat forward, hungry for it, needing to prove something to someone, maybe themselves most of all. Ava sat in the 3rd row between a former Army Ranger who looked like he bench-pressed Volkswagens for fun and a wiry woman in her early 30s whose folder said she'd done 3 years with Blackwater in Iraq before the company rebranded and pretended to get religion. Elena Vasquez. James had read her file twice, and both times his gut had sent up warning flares. Former cartel enforcer turned federal informant. The kind of complicated that usually meant trouble. The kind James would normally reject outright. But her skill set was undeniable, and the FBI had vouched for her, for whatever that was worth these days. "Welcome to Maddox Security Solutions," James began, his voice carrying the parade ground authority of 3 decades giving orders that meant life or death. "This isn't the military. Nobody here gets to hide behind rank or regulation or the certainty that if you screw up, someone above you will catch the fallback. This is private sector. We protect diplomats in war zones, extract hostages from compounds where the local government is either complicit or useless. Guard convoys through territory where being American makes you a target worth more than most people's annual salary. He paused, letting that sink in, watching faces process the reality of what they'd signed up for. You fail here, you go home embarrassed. You fail in the field, people die. Maybe you. Maybe the client you swore to protect. Maybe your teammate who trusted you to have their back when the shooting started and everything went sideways and there was no extraction coming because the bird couldn't land and you had to shoot your way out or die trying. Ava's face remained impassive, but James saw the slight tightening around her eyes. She'd been there, done that, had the scar tissue to prove it. A mortar round in Sangin that killed two of her teammates while she dragged a third to cover with shrapnel in her leg and a concussion that had her seeing double. She'd saved the Marine's life and earned a Navy Commendation Medal that James kept in his desk drawer because looking at it made him proud and terrified in equal measure. The next 72 hours will test every assumption you have about yourself, James continued. Some of you will discover you're stronger than you thought. Most of you will discover you're exactly as strong as you thought, which won't be enough. A few of you will surprise everyone, including yourselves. Those are the ones we want. He gestured to Tommy, who stepped forward with a clipboard and the kind of smile that made recruits nervous. Chief Castellano will brief you on the evolution schedule. 3 days, minimal sleep, maximum stress. We simulate everything you'll face in the field except the actual bullets. And trust me, you'll wish for bullets, at least those you can see coming. The room stirred with nervous energy, people shifting in their seats, checking gear, exchanging glances that ranged from confident to terrified. James caught Ava's eye for just a second, and in that second he saw Sarah again, saw her in the hospital bed with machines beeping and tubes running and her hand gripping his with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone that close to the end. "Promise me," Sarah had whispered, her voice barely audible over the morphine pump's mechanical hiss. "Promise you'll let her fly, let her fall, let her learn, but always let her know you're proud." James had promised. He'd held her hand and promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. And then Sarah had slipped away in the early hours of a Tuesday morning while James was asleep in the chair beside her bed, and he'd woken up to a silence that still haunted him 5 years later. The door at the back of the briefing room opened, and James felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees. Marcus Kovic walked in with the casual confidence of a man who owned the space he occupied, who believed the world owed him deference and had never quite forgiven it for disagreeing. 45 years old, 6 feet of coiled violence wrapped in tactical gear that probably cost more than most recruits made in a month. He moved like a predator, and his eyes found James immediately. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular military formality that meant the exact opposite of respect. "Ladies, hope I'm not interrupting. Colonel Maddox." The last part came with the nod that might have passed for polite in any context that didn't include 15 years of history, most of it bad. James felt his jaw tighten. Tommy's hand moved subtly toward the sidearm on his hip, emotion so ingrained it was practically autonomic. Marcus noticed, smiled that smile that made James want to introduce his face to the nearest hard surface. "Kovic," James acknowledged, keeping his voice level, professional. "Wasn't expecting ironclad representation today." "Last-minute addition," Marcus replied, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "Senator Dutch's office sent this over. Guest evaluator status for the duration of Hell Week. Transparency, oversight, making sure everything's above board. You know how it is these days. Lots of scrutiny on private military contractors, especially with the new federal contracts coming up for bid." He handed the paper to Tommy, who scanned it with the expression of a man reading his own indictment. James didn't need to read it. He knew exactly what it said, could practically see Senator Dutch's greasy fingerprints all over it. Richard Dutch, career politician who'd never met a defense contractor he couldn't do a favor for, provided the check cleared. Ironclad Tactical was Dutch's golden child, the company he'd funneled contracts to for the better part of a decade while companies like Maddox Security fought for scraps. And now Marcus was here, in James's compound, with official authorization to observe, to evaluate, to find any flaw or failure or excuse to write a report that would tank Maddox's chances at the upcoming federal contracts that meant the difference between staying in business and shutting down. "Everything here is above board," James said carefully. "Always has been." "I'm sure," Marcus replied, and the smile never touched his eyes. Still, never hurts to have an extra set of eyes, right? Especially given some of the candidates you're running through the program these days. His gaze drifted to Ava, lingered there just a second too long. James felt something cold and sharp slide between his ribs, some primal instinct that predated language, that came from the same place that made fathers wake up in the middle of the night when their children were in danger. Marcus knew, of course he knew, he'd done his homework, understood exactly where to apply pressure to get maximum pain. Ava met Marcus's gaze without flinching, without acknowledging the implied challenge. She'd learned that from James, from all those hours on the range, and the mat and the obstacle courses he'd built in their backyard when she was 8 years old, and already showing the kind of determination that worried him even then. Control your emotions or they control you. Sarah had hated it, thought James was turning their daughter into a little soldier when she should have been playing with dolls and having tea parties. But Ava had wanted it, needed it the same way some kids needed music or art or sports. She'd found herself in the discipline, in the training, in becoming something more than what the world expected from a girl who barely cleared 5 feet tall on her 12th birthday. Candidates are candidates, James said, putting steel in his voice. They all get the same test. They all live with the same results. Of course, Marcus agreed. That's what makes it fair. The word fair landed like a thrown knife, and everyone in the room felt it, because nothing about this was fair. Not Marcus being here, not the political games, not the fact that James had to choose between protecting his daughter and proving his program worked, between family and reputation, between the promise he'd made to Sarah and the company that bore his name. Tommy cleared his throat, breaking the tension before it could crystallize into something uglier. All right, candidates, first evolution starts at 0500. That's 4 hours from now. I suggest you use that time to square away your gear, get your heads right, and make peace with whatever God you pray to, because the next 72 hours are going to test your faith in ways Sunday school never prepared you for. The room emptied with the controlled chaos of people trying to look professional while moving fast. Ava filed out with the others, didn't look back, didn't acknowledge James at all. That was procedure, that was right, but it still felt like a small death. Marcus lingered, waiting until the last candidate cleared the door before speaking. Your daughter's impressive, he said conversationally. 4 deployments with Force Recon, Navy Commendation Medal, expert marksman rating. Hell of a resume. She earned every bit of it, James replied. I'm sure she did. Marcus moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. You know, I remember when Sarah was sick, heard you called in favors to keep Ava stateside toward the end. Made sure she got emergency leave. That's what a good father does. Protects his children. The words hung in the air like smoke from a chemical fire, toxic and spreading. But out here, Marcus continued, there's no favors, no calls to pull, just candidates and standards and whether they measure up. Looking forward to seeing how this plays out, Colonel. He left, and the room felt colder for his absence. Tommy waited a full 30 seconds before speaking. That was a threat. I know. He's going to come after her, after both of you. I know. And we can't stop him without proving every critic right, every politician who says you only hired your daughter because of nepotism, every talking head who claims women can't cut it in this field. James turned to face his oldest friend, and Tommy saw something in his expression that made him take an involuntary step back. It was the look James got in Mogadishu when the mission went sideways, and the extraction bird was shot down, and they had to fight their way through 2 kilometers of hostile city with half their team wounded and ammunition running low. The look that said he'd do whatever it took, pay whatever price, cross whatever line necessary to complete the objective. Then we let her prove them wrong, James said quietly. We let her fight her own fight. That's what Sarah asked. That's what I promised. And if Kovic destroys her in the process? James was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the compound below, at the barracks where 40 candidates were settling in, preparing for the kind of hell that would break most of them. Somewhere down there, Ava was doing the same, probably running through mental checklists, probably thinking about the evolution schedule, probably not sleeping because she never slept well before operations. Had been that way since her first deployment. Then I'll have failed her twice, James said finally. Once by not protecting her, and once by trying to. The night settled over the Montana compound like a lead blanket, temperature dropping to somewhere around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make exposed skin burn and breath crystallize in the air like tiny clouds of frozen regret. In the barracks, 40 candidates tried to grab whatever sleep they could before 0500 arrived, with all the mercy of a mortar round. Ava lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of people who didn't know what real exhaustion felt like, yet trying to rest. Snoring from the bunk two over, someone's gear rattling as they adjusted it for the 100th time, whispered conversations that faded into silence as people realized talking just made the waiting worse. She'd been here before, in different compounds, different countries, same anticipatory tension that felt like electricity running through your veins. The night before her first deployment, she'd been so nervous she'd thrown up twice and couldn't eat breakfast. By her fourth deployment, she'd learned to embrace it, channel it, use it as fuel. Fear was just another resource if you knew how to harvest it. Someone approached her bunk in the darkness, and Ava's hand moved automatically to the knife she kept strapped to her thigh, a habit from Helmand Province that she'd never broken and never would. "Easy," came a woman's voice, accented with something that spoke of the Texas-Mexico border. "Just wanted to introduce myself properly. Elena Vasquez." Ava relaxed slightly, but didn't move her hand far from the blade. In the dim emergency lighting alone, Elena's face was all angles and shadows, sharp features that belonged on someone who'd seen the kind of violence that changed your wiring permanently. "Ava Maddox," she replied, though they both knew Elena already knew exactly who she was. "Your father runs a good outfit," Elena said, settling onto the floor beside Ava's bunk, with the casual ease of someone comfortable in uncomfortable places. "I've worked for a lot of organizations, and most of them were either incompetent or evil or both. This one seems different." "You worked for cartels," Ava stated flatly, no judgment in her voice, just fact. Elena smiled without warmth. "I did. Sinaloa mostly. Enforcement, protection, the kind of work that pays well and costs everything else. My sister thought she could change things from the inside, work with the federales, be the good guy. They found her body in pieces scattered across 3 states. That was my wake-up call. Turned informant, helped FBI, take down half a cell, and now I'm here trying to figure out what the hell to do with the rest of my life." "Why tell me this?" "Because I read people for a living. Had to, or I'd be dead 10 times over. And I read that evaluator, Kovic, when he looked at you." Elena's voice dropped lower, serious. "He's got plans, bad ones. And your father can't help you without making it worse." Ava was quiet for a moment, processing. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to paranoia or politics, or the kind of game playing that infected every organization once it got big enough. But another part, the part that had kept her alive through 4 deployments, recognized truth when it heard it. "What kind of plans?" Elena shrugged. "Don't know specifics yet, but I've seen that look before, in cartel enforcers who had a score to settle. It's personal for him. Whatever history he has with your father, he's planning to settle it through you." "Let him try," Ava said, and meant it. "That's what my sister said," Elena replied softly, "right before they killed her." The words hung between them in the darkness, heavy with implication and warning, and the kind of wisdom that only came from watching people you loved pay the price for underestimating their enemies. Before Ava could respond, the barracks door crashed open and Tommy's voice boomed through the space like artillery fire. "On your feet, candidates. Evolution 1 starts now. If you're not in formation in 3 minutes, you fail. Clock's ticking." The barracks exploded into motion, people scrambling for gear, pulling on boots, cursing in the darkness as they slammed into each other and bunks and their own limitations. Ava moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over, grabbing her ruck and rifle and assault vest in a sequence she'd performed hundreds of times. Beside her, Elena moved just as smoothly, and Ava noted it, filed it away under useful information for later. They formed up outside in the brutal cold, breath steaming, 40 bodies shivering in formation, while Tommy walked the line like a shark circling wounded prey. Marcus stood to the side, clipboard in hand, watching everything with the focused intensity of a man looking for ammunition. 12-mile ruck march, Tommy announced. 60-pound packs, full gear, weapons condition 1, course runs through the mountain trails, elevation gain of 2,500 feet, and if you fall out, you're done. Questions? Nobody spoke. Questions were for people who thought they had options. "Outstanding, step off in 30 seconds. James watched from the observation deck as the formation moved out into the darkness, headlamps bobbing like fireflies in a river of night. He found Ava's light easily, tracked it through the column, watched how she kept pace without apparent effort while others were already struggling, watched how she adjusted her ruck straps on the move, minor corrections that would prevent major problems later. That was his teaching, drilled into her from childhood. Take care of the details, and the big picture takes care of itself. He'd learned it in Delta, passed it to her in 1,000 small lessons, in the way he'd made her clean her weapons even when they were already spotless, made her check her gear even when she'd just checked it, made her prepare for contingencies that seemed paranoid until the day they saved your life. Marcus appeared beside him without announcement, ghost quiet despite his size. She's running middle of the pack, he observed, expected her to be up front, showing off. She's smart, James replied, conserving energy. It's a long 72 hours. Smart like her father taught her. Smart like she learned on 4 deployments. Marcus made a non-committal sound. Must be difficult watching her go through this. Knowing you can't help. Knowing that anything you do to make it easier for her just proves what everyone suspects. James kept his eyes on the bobbing lights, on the columns snaking through the darkness toward the mountain trails that would break at least half these candidates before the sun came up. What do you want, Marcus? Want? I don't want anything, Colonel. I'm just here to observe, to evaluate, to make sure everything's fair and above board. A pause. But since you asked, I'll tell you what I remember. Afghanistan, 2003, Firebase Viper. We had intelligence about a weapons cache, and I called for a tactical strike. You disagreed, said the intel was bad, but I outranked you then, so we went anyway. James's hands gripped the railing, knuckles going white. 3 soldiers died when it turned out to be a civilian compound. Not a weapons cache, a school. You wrote it up as intelligence failure, enemy using human shields, all the right words to cover your ass. But I was there. I saw you confirm targets you knew weren't valid because the mission had momentum, and calling it off would have made you look weak. That's not how it happened, Marcus said, but his voice carried an edge now, the professional mask slipping. I testified to exactly how it happened. At your court-martial, under oath, ended your career, destroyed your reputation, cost you everything, and I'd do it again tomorrow because those soldiers deserve truth, not a cover story. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of pretense, raw with something that might have been honesty or might have been the kind of poison that festered for 15 years until it became indistinguishable from truth. You self-righteous son of a bitch. You stood there in that hearing room and destroyed me while pretending it was about honor, about integrity. But it wasn't. It was about you being right and me being wrong, about you proving you were the better soldier, the better man. You took everything from me, Maddox, my career, my reputation, my future, and now I'm going to return the favor. He gestured toward the darkness where the candidates had disappeared. Your daughter out there, she's good, maybe even great, but she's got one weakness. Same weakness you had, same weakness your wife had. She actually gives a damn, actually believes in something beyond herself. That makes her predictable. That makes her vulnerable. And over the next 72 hours, I'm going to prove it. James turned to face Marcus fully, and the movement was deliberate, controlled, the kind of slow pivot that preceded violence. You come after my daughter, you better be prepared for what comes back at you. Marcus smiled, and it was genuine this time. The smile of a man who'd finally maneuvered his opponent into position and was about to spring the trap. But that's the beauty of it, Colonel. I don't have to come after her. The system will do it for me. The standards, the evolutions, the expectations. All I have to do is watch and document and write a report that says exactly what I see. And if what I see is a candidate who can't hack it, who only got this far because of nepotism, who fails when it counts, well, that's just objective observation. You can't fight that without admitting the whole thing is rigged in her favor. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, an echo of earlier. Senator Dutch sends his regards, by the way. Looking forward to reading my assessment report. The federal contracts are going to be very interested in whether Maddox Security Solutions maintains proper standards, treats all candidates equally, doesn't show favoritism. Sleep well, Colonel. The door closed behind him, and James was alone in the observation room with the darkness and the distant sounds of candidates suffering through the first evolution and a rage that felt like molten metal in his chest. Tommy found him an hour later, still standing at the window, still watching lights move through the mountain darkness, like stars that had fallen to Earth and were trying to find their way home. Ava's holding strong, Tommy reported, maintaining pace, helping slower candidates with technique. She's doing good. Marcus told me his plan, James said, voice flat. He's going to let the system break her. Document every struggle, every moment of weakness. Write it up as evidence she doesn't belong. And we can't stop him without proving him right. Tommy was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of friendship, of missions that went wrong and missions that went right, and all the gray area in between. You remember Mogadishu? Every day. You remember what you told me when the extraction bird went down and we were surrounded and everyone thought we were dead? James did remember. Remembered the chaos and the fear and the certainty that they weren't walking out of that city alive. Remembered making the call that saved their team and nearly cost him his career. I told you we adapt, we overcome, and we survive, no matter what it takes. And we did, Tommy said, because you trusted the team, trusted us to do our jobs, to have your back, to not need you to carry us. You trusted us to be what you trained us to be. He put his hand on James's shoulder, squeezed once. Ava is what you trained her to be. Maybe it's time to trust that. In the darkness of the Montana wilderness, on a trail that climbed toward the sky like a stairway built by someone who hated humanity, Ava Maddox put one foot in front of the other and focused on breathing. 60 pounds of gear dug into her shoulders, her legs burned with lactic acid, and the cold turned every breath into a knife in her lungs. Around her, candidates were starting to break, to fall out, to discover that the gap between who they thought they were and who they actually were could be measured in miles of suffering on a mountain trail at dark 30. Ahead, she saw someone stumble, go down hard, ruck and rifle clattering. Without thinking, Ava moved forward, grabbed the candidate by the drag handle on their vest, hauled them upright. It was Danny Chen, youngest candidate in the group at 24, former Army specialist with more heart than sense. I got you, Ava said, steadying him. Check your pack straps. You're loading weight wrong. Danny nodded, adjusted, found his balance again. Behind them, Elena appeared like a ghost, checking Danny's gear with practiced efficiency, making minute corrections that would prevent bigger problems later. We move together or we don't move at all, Elena said quietly. That's how you survive the things that want to kill you. They moved out as a unit, 3 strangers bound by nothing except the shared understanding that the world was full of things trying to break you, and sometimes the only way to survive was to refuse to break alone. Somewhere behind them, in the darkness and cold and suffering, Marcus Kovic watched through night vision optics and made notes on his clipboard, and smiled the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. But in the observation deck, James Maddox watched the same scene and saw something different. Saw his daughter doing exactly what he'd trained her to do, what Sarah had believed she could do, what she'd been preparing her entire life to prove. And for the first time since Marcus had walked through his door with Senator Dutch's paperwork and 15 years of vendetta, James felt something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of faith that the promise he'd made to Sarah hadn't been a lie, that his daughter could fly, could fall, could learn, and could rise again stronger than before. The lights kept moving through the darkness, ascending toward dawn, and the first evolution of Hell Week ground forward like the slow turn of a wheel that crushed everything too weak to endure its weight. This was just the beginning. This was where legends were forged or destroyed. And somewhere in that darkness, a father learned to let go, and a daughter learned what it meant to stand alone, and a ghost from the past prepared to exact revenge that had been 15 years in the making. The last lesson was about to begin. Dawn came to the Montana compound the way it always did in November, reluctant and cold, painting the sky in shades of gray that promised nothing except more suffering. 27 candidates stood in formation outside the barracks, 13 having already quit during the 12-mile ruck march, their absence like missing teeth in a smile that was never pretty to begin with. Steam rose from their bodies in the freezing air, mixing with breath and sweat and the particular smell of people who'd been pushed past comfortable and were heading toward broken. Ava stood at attention in the 3rd row, every muscle in her legs screaming protest. The broken rib she suspected from yesterday's hand-to-hand qualifier sending sharp reminders with each breath. She'd taped it tight in the barracks bathroom at 0400, the way her father had taught her when she was 16, and cracked 2 ribs falling off the obstacle course he'd built in their backyard. Ice it, tape it, take ibuprofen, and keep moving because pain was just information and you could decide what to do with information. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the morning stillness, growing louder, more insistent. The kind of sound that made everyone who'd spent time in combat zones instinctively check their surroundings and calculate distances to cover. A black executive helicopter descended toward the landing pad near the main building, expensive and sleek, the kind of bird that carried people who made decisions about other people's lives from the comfort of leather seats and climate control. Tommy stood at the front of the formation, clipboard in hand, his weathered face revealing nothing. But Ava had known him since she was 8 years old, had learned to read the subtle tells that betrayed what he was thinking. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. Something was wrong, something worse than Hell Week was supposed to be. The helicopter settled onto the pad, rotors winding down, and a door opened. Senator Richard Dutch emerged first, 60 pounds overweight and dressed in business casual that probably cost more than most candidates made in a month. Behind him came an aide carrying cameras and recording equipment, and behind them, Marcus Kovic, moving with the fluid confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards and was about to play them. James appeared from the main building, and even from this distance, Ava could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like a man walking into an ambush with no backup and no way out. He met the senator halfway, shook hands with the mechanical precision of someone performing a distasteful but necessary duty. The voices carried across the compound, not quite loud enough to make out words, but the tone was clear, political, performative. The kind of conversation where every word was chosen for how it would sound on a recording or in a report or in front of a committee deciding where to allocate hundreds of millions in federal contracts. Tommy finally spoke, his voice cutting through the morning like a blade. Listen up. We've got VIP observers for the duration. That means cameras, that means scrutiny, that means every evolution is going to be documented for posterity in politics. You will conduct yourselves as professionals. You will maintain standards. You will remember that you represent not just yourselves, but everyone who came before you and everyone who will come after. Clear? A ragged chorus of affirmatives rose from the formation. Outstanding. Next evolution begins in 30 minutes. Drownproofing. Lake water temperature is 34 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll be bound hand and foot and required to survive 10 minutes. Anyone wants to quit now and save themselves the hypothermia, step forward. Nobody moved. Nobody ever moved at that point, even though they should have, even though the smart play was recognizing when you were beaten and walking away with dignity intact. But Hell Week stripped away smart and left only stubborn, left only the part of the human animal that would rather than admit defeat. The formation broke and candidates moved toward the equipment shed to draw their gear for the water evolution. Ava held back, watching as her father finished his conversation with Senator Dutch, watching as the senator gestured toward her, said something that made Marcus smile that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with malice. Elena materialized beside her, quiet as smoke. That's bad, Elena said, not bothering with preamble or pretense. Politicians showing up during Hell Week means someone's building a case, and I've seen enough cases built to know how they end. What kind of case? The kind where they've already decided the outcome and just need footage to support it. Your father's company is in someone's way, probably Dutch's. They want Maddox Security Solutions to fail this evaluation so they can justify giving contracts to whoever's paying the senator's bills. Ava watched her father walk back toward the main building, watched the set of his shoulders, the weight he carried that had nothing to do with physical burden and everything to do with watching your life's work get dismantled by people who'd never put on a uniform or heard a shot fired in anger. He can't help me without making it worse, Ava said quietly. If he shows favoritism, they use it as proof of nepotism. If he pulls me from evolutions for safety, they claim the program isn't rigorous enough. He's trapped. We're all trapped, Elena replied. Question is whether we fight our way out or let them bury us. The lake stretched before them like a sheet of hammered steel, surface smooth and cold, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. A wooden platform jutted into the water, and beside it floated 2 rescue boats manned by safety personnel who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Camera equipment lined the shore, multiple angles, high-definition documentation of everything that was about to happen. Senator Dutch stood near the cameras, coat pulled tight against the wind that came off the water carrying the scent of pine and ice and something that tasted like broken dreams. Marcus stood beside him, clipboard ready, the perfect image of professional evaluation. Tommy briefed the evolution with mechanical efficiency, demonstrating the technique, showing how to position your body, how to dolphin kick with bound legs, how to surface and breathe and survive when everything was working against you. Some candidates were already shivering, and they hadn't even entered the water yet. Ava watched the demonstration with the detached focus she'd learned in Afghanistan, compartmentalizing fear and cold, and the knowledge that this was going to hurt in ways that made the ruck march look pleasant. She'd done cold water training before, in Coronado during pre-deployment workup, but that had been California cold, not Montana in November cold, not the kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. The first candidate entered the water, a former ranger named Martinez who'd been solid through every evolution so far. He lasted 4 minutes before the safety personnel pulled him out, his lips blue, his body convulsing with shivers that looked like seizures. The medic wrapped him in thermal blankets and called it, sent him to the warming tent, eliminated from Hell Week. 3 more candidates went through, and 3 more failed to make the 10-minute mark. The cold was just too much, too immediate, too visceral. Your body started shutting down systems, prioritizing core temperature there over everything else. And no amount of willpower could override biology when biology decided you were dying. Ava stepped forward when Tommy called her number, and she felt every eye on her, felt the weight of cameras and expectations, and her father's presence somewhere in the observation area, watching through glass that might as well have been a wall between dimensions. Tommy secured the bindings on her wrists with professional detachment, then her ankles, tight enough to restrict movement, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. He leaned close as he checked the knots, his voice barely audible over the wind. Your father's watching, so is everyone who wants to see you fail. Don't give them the satisfaction. Then he straightened, stepped back, and Ava was alone on the platform with nothing between her and the water except the distance of a single step. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was thinking, and thinking was the enemy. She stepped off the platform and the water swallowed her whole. The cold hit like a physical blow, like being beaten with a hammer made of ice and malevolence. Every nerve ending screamed, every muscle seized, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Ava forgot how to breathe, forgot everything except the overwhelming sensation of wrongness that came from being submerged in water cold enough to stop your heart. She fought to the surface through sheer muscle memory, through 15 years of her father's training overriding the panic that wanted to flood her system and shut everything down. Her head broke the surface and she sucked in air that burned her lungs like fire, paradoxically painful after the cold. 10 minutes. She needed to survive 10 minutes. The first minute was chaos, her body trying to process what was happening, trying to decide if this was a threat that required immediate response or something it could adapt to. Ava forced herself to focus on technique, on the dolphin kick that would keep her afloat, on the breathing rhythm that would prevent hyperventilation. By the second minute, the shivering started, violent and uncontrollable. Her body's attempt to generate heat in an environment that was stealing it faster than she could produce it. The bindings on her wrists and ankles made everything harder, turned simple survival into a complex problem that required constant adjustment and adaptation. The third minute brought a strange clarity, a dissociation that came from her brain starting to prioritize differently. She was still in the water, still cold, but it felt distant somehow, like it was happening to someone else, and she was just observing. Dangerous. That was the beginning of hypothermia, the seductive whisper that said stopping would be easier than continuing. In the fourth minute, she went under. Not intentionally, just a mistake in timing, a wave that caught her wrong. Water filled her mouth and nose, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, in the backyard pool, her father teaching her to swim, while her mother watched from the patio, with that expression that said she loved them both, but wasn't sure this was the right way to show it. I got you, baby girl, her father's voice echoed across 20 years. I got you. But he didn't have her now, couldn't have her. She was alone in water cold enough to kill, bound and struggling and starting to lose the battle against biology and physics and the fundamental indifference of the universe to human survival. She kicked hard, fought back to the surface, broke through coughing and gasping. The safety personnel in the boats were watching her closely now, hands on equipment, ready to pull her out. She shook her head as violently as the cold and exhaustion allowed, a clear signal that said she wasn't done, wasn't quitting, wasn't giving Marcus Kovic or Senator Dutch or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her fail. The fifth minute was acceptance. Acceptance that this hurt, that it was going to keep hurting, that the only way through was through. Ava settled into a rhythm, mechanical and precise. Dolphin kick and surface and breathe and repeat, over and over, each cycle its own small victory. The sixth minute brought hallucination. She saw her mother on the shore, standing in the morning light, wearing the blue dress she'd been buried in, smiling that sad smile she'd had toward the end when the pain was bad, but she was trying to be brave for everyone else. Sarah Maddox, who'd never wanted her daughter to be a soldier, but had loved her enough to let her become one anyway. Let her fly, her mother's voice whispered across the water. Let her fall, let her learn. Ava blinked and her mother was gone, if she'd ever been there at all, replaced by the stark reality of cameras and observers and people waiting to document her failure. The seventh minute, she went under again, and this time it took longer to surface. Her legs were barely responding, the muscles compromised by cold, the nerve signals getting lost somewhere between brain and body. She broke the surface more slowly this time, and the safety personnel were moving their boat closer, clearly debating whether to pull her despite her protests. 8 minutes. Her vision was starting to narrow, tunnel vision that came from her body shutting down peripheral systems to preserve the core. She could see the platform, see Tommy standing there with his stopwatch, see the shape of people on shore but not their faces, not their expressions. 9 minutes. She was barely staying afloat now, each dolphin kick weaker than the last, each breath shallower. Her body was shutting down, going into emergency mode, and she was losing the fight to keep it operational. From somewhere on shore, she heard a commotion, voices raised in argument. Through the fog that was settling over her consciousness, she recognized one voice, her father, shouting something, the words lost to distance and water, and the roaring in her ears that sounded like the ocean or like dying or maybe both. 10 minutes. The stopwatch beeped, and hands grabbed her, pulled her from the water with practiced efficiency. She was in the boat, thermal blankets wrapping around her, someone checking her vitals while someone else radioed for the medic. Through chattering teeth and violent shivers, Ava managed to focus on Tommy's face as he leaned over her. "You made it," he said, and there was something in his expression that might have been pride or might have been concern or might have been both. 10 minutes exactly. You passed. Then the world tilted and went gray, and Ava was somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere that smelled like antiseptic and heating units and the particular scent of medical care. Ava lay on a cot with heat packs. Positioned strategically around her body, an IV in her arm pumping warm fluids, her core temperature slowly climbing from the dangerous territory it had dropped into. Her father sat beside the cot, and he looked older than she'd ever seen him. Older than 60, older than time, his face carved into lines of worry and guilt and something that might have been fear. His hand rested on hers, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers, the only outward sign of whatever was happening inside him. "Your core temp dropped to 94.3, James said quietly. "Another minute, and they would have had to pull you. Should have pulled you." Ava's voice came out rough, damaged by cold and coughing. "But they didn't. I finished. You almost died." That's the point of the evolution, to see who keeps going when dying seems easier than continuing. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades, of choices made and regretted, of promises kept and broken. "Your mother made me promise to let you live your own life, fight your own battles. And I did promise. But watching you in that water, watching you go under and not knowing if you'd surface, I realized something. Keeping that promise might kill me faster than any bullet or bomb ever could." Ava squeezed his hand, or tried to, her grip still weak from the cold and exhaustion. "You called my commanding officers in Afghanistan multiple times, made sure I was never assigned to the most dangerous sectors. I found out, Dad. I found out you'd been pulling strings to keep me safe." James looked up, met her eyes, and there was no denial there, no attempt to justify or excuse. "I did, and I'd do it again. You think that makes me a hypocrite? You think that means I don't believe in you? Maybe it does. But I watched your mother die over 6 months. Watched her waste away while I held her hand and couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. I'm not strong enough to watch you die too. I'm just not. The honesty of it hit harder than any criticism or anger could have. This was the truth beneath everything. The raw wound that hadn't healed and maybe never would. James Maddox, Delta Force operator who'd survived 35 years in the most dangerous profession on Earth, wasn't afraid of enemy fire or impossible missions or any threat he could point a weapon at. He was afraid of losing the people he loved, afraid of being helpless while they suffered, afraid of surviving them and having to carry that weight for whatever time he had left. I'm not Mom, Ava said softly, and this isn't cancer. This is what I trained for, what I'm good at. You taught me how to survive. You taught me how to fight. You taught me how to be exactly who I am. And now you have to trust that those lessons took. Before James could respond, the tent flap opened and Elena entered, moving with the casual ease of someone who belonged wherever she decided to be. She took in the scene with a glance, assessed and categorized, and filed away for later use. They're saying your pack straps were tampered with during the ruck march, Elena said without preamble. And someone mixed real ammunition with the sim rounds in the supply shed for the next evolution. I've seen this pattern before. Someone's escalating. James stood, and the transformation was immediate. The grieving father replaced by the operator who'd spent decades dealing with threats and calculating responses. Who? Marcus's crew. I don't have proof, but I've been watching. They're moving pieces into position, setting up situations designed to look like accidents. The kind of accidents that get people killed and programs shut down. The next evolution, Tommy said, appearing in the tent entrance, his face grim. It's a field exercise. 48 hours, teams of 4, navigate 50 miles through mountain terrain and complete objectives. Op 4 will be running harassment, trying to capture teams, make them fail. Marcus just volunteered his people to run Op 4. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a chemical fire. Op 4, the opposition force, was supposed to provide realistic resistance, make things difficult but not dangerous. But if Marcus was running it, with his crew, with his agenda, then difficulty wasn't what they'd be providing. James looked at Ava, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, saw him weighing options and outcomes and the probability of disaster. You can pull out, he said carefully. Medical withdrawal, legitimate reason. Nobody could fault you for it after the hypothermia. Is that what you want me to do? I want you safe. I want you alive. I want you to not have to prove anything to anyone because I already know what you're capable of. But that's not how this works, Ava replied. You know it's not. I pull out now, every critic gets vindicated. Every politician who thinks women don't belong in this field gets their proof. Every candidate who comes after me has to fight that much harder because I gave them ammunition. She pushed herself up on the cot, ignoring the medic's protests, ignoring the dizziness that came from moving too fast. I'm finishing this. Whatever Marcus has planned, whatever games Senator Dutch is playing, I'm finishing this. Because Mom asked you to let me fly, but she also taught me that flying means risking the fall. And I'm not afraid of falling, Dad. I'm afraid of never jumping in the first place. The field exercise briefing happened at sunset, golden light painting the compound in shades of amber and shadow. The last warmth of day before the temperature dropped into single digits and darkness claimed the Montana wilderness. 24 candidates stood in formation, 3 having quit after the drownproofing evolution, their absence noted and documented, and added to the statistics that someone in Senator Dutch's office would use to justify whatever conclusion they had already reached. Teams of 4 drawn randomly, or at least ostensibly randomly. Ava found herself assigned with Elena Vasquez, Danny Chen, and a former police officer named Ben Pritchard, who'd been solid through every evolution and barely spoke, except to confirm orders or ask technical questions. It was a good team, diverse skill sets, mutual respect, the kind of group that could function under stress if they didn't let ego get in the way. Tommy briefed the course using a terrain map that showed 50 miles of mountain wilderness, elevation changes, river crossings, objectives marked with coordinates that would test navigation and endurance, and the ability to function when exhausted and cold and pushed beyond rational limits. Upfer will be active throughout the course, Tommy explained. his voice carrying the parade ground authority of someone who'd given 1,000 briefings and knew exactly how to calibrate for maximum retention. They'll be running harassment, trying to capture teams, force you to adapt and overcome. Rules of engagement are simple. They tag you, you're captured, your team has 10 minutes to execute a rescue or continue without you. Get captured twice, you fail the evolution. Questions? Danny raised his hand. What weapons are up for carrying? Simunition rounds only, Tommy replied. Non-lethal, but they'll sting like hell and leave marks. Treat them like real threats. Anyone takes a hit to a vital zone, they're wounded and have to be carried or treated. This is as real as we can make it without actually shooting you. Marcus stepped forward from his position near the senator, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes carrying something else, something that made Ava's instincts send up warning flares. My team will be running up for, Marcus announced. We've got 4 operators with extensive combat experience, and we'll be pushing you hard. This isn't summer camp. This is preparation for the real thing, and the real thing doesn't care about your feelings or your limitations. So if you can't handle pressure here, you damn sure can't handle it in a war zone. His gaze found Ava, held there for just a second too long, and she read the message clearly. This was personal. This was revenge. And whatever was coming in those mountains, it wasn't going to follow any rules except the ones Marcus made up as he went. The teams moved out at dusk, spaced 30 minutes apart, heading into terrain that looked beautiful in the fading light and would become hostile and unforgiving once darkness fell complete. Iva's team moved with practiced efficiency, Danny on point with his navigation skills, Ben pulling rear security, Elena and Ava in the middle formation, everyone alert to the environment and each other. They made good progress through the first 6 hours, covering nearly 15 miles despite the terrain and darkness, stopping every hour for brief navigation checks and water. The temperature dropped steadily, their breath steaming in the air, frost forming on their gear and weapons. Hour 7, they heard the first sounds of contact. Distant gunfire, some munition rounds that sounded like firecrackers in the night. Someone else's team making contact with Op 4. The radio crackled with traffic, a team leader calling for support, then silence. Captured or eliminated. Elena moved up beside Ava during a halt, her voice barely audible. Something's wrong. OP, for shouldn't be this aggressive this early. They're supposed to harass, not eliminate. Someone changed the mission parameters. Marcus, Ava said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus, which means we need to assume nothing's going according to the briefing. We need to assume they're actually trying to hurt us. Before Ava could respond, Danny's voice came sharp over the radio. Contact front. Multiple signatures, closing fast. The team went tactical immediately, moving off the trail into cover, establishing fields of fire, preparing for whatever was coming. Through night vision optics, Ava saw them. 4 figures moving with military precision, weapons up, advancing in a formation that spoke of real combat experience and serious intent. Marcus's crew. Sledge Romano in the lead, massive and aggressive. Kevin Mills flanking right, moving like the sniper he was, calculating angles and distance. Luis Cortez on the left, cocky and dangerous. Derek Thompson bringing up rear. And even at this distance, Ava could see he was moving wrong, too aggressive, too eager. They're not using harassment tactics, Ben observed quietly. That's an assault formation. Rules just changed, Elena said, chambering around. We adapt or we get rolled. The firefight lasted 8 minutes, brutal and chaotic in the darkness. Simunition rounds cracking through the air. People moving and shooting and trying to maintain cohesion while everything fell apart. Ava's team held their position, used terrain to advantage, fought smart instead of hard. But Marcus's crew wasn't playing by rules. Sledge charged their position with complete disregard for cover, taking hits that should have eliminated him but ignoring them, closing distance until he was on top of their position. Ben went down with Sledge's hands around his throat, not tagged, not eliminated, actually being choked. Ava moved without thinking, muscle memory and training overriding conscious thought. She hit Sledge from the side with her full body weight, breaking his grip on Ben, rolling with him down a slight embankment. They came apart at the bottom, both scrambling for position, and Sledge was smiling, actually smiling, like this was fun, like hurting people was entertainment. Nothing personal, he said, advancing, just following orders. He threw a punch that would have broken bone if it landed, but Ava wasn't there, was moving like her father had taught her, like the Marine Corps had refined, slipping the blow and countering with strikes to nerve clusters and pressure points. Sledge absorbed punishment that should have dropped him and kept coming. And Ava realized with cold clarity that this wasn't training anymore, wasn't evolution or assessment or any pretense of legitimate evaluation. This was attempted murder dressed up as training, and Marcus was somewhere out there watching, documenting, building his case while his crew tried to hurt people under the cover of Hell Week protocols. Danny's voice cracked over the radio, panicked and young. "I'm hit. Real round, not sim, I'm actually hit." Everything stopped. Even Sledge paused, his expression shifting from aggression to something that might have been confusion or might have been recognition that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Ava broke contact, sprinted back to their position. Danny was on the ground, blood spreading from his thigh, his face pale in the night vision green. Ben was already applying a tourniquet with the trained efficiency of someone who'd done it before, but his hands were shaking and his voice was tight. "This is real. Someone loaded real ammunition. We need medevac now." Elena was on the radio, calling it in, her voice controlled but urgent. Ava knelt beside Danny, took his hand, felt how cold it was, how the shock was already setting in. "Stay with me," she said, and heard her father's voice echoing across decades of training. "Stay with me, Marine. We don't quit. We don't stop. We bring everyone home." Danny nodded weakly, and Ava could see in his eyes that he was young, too young, that he'd signed up for this thinking it would be hard but fair, thinking the rules meant something, thinking adults in charge would keep them safe. She believed that too once, a long time ago. The medevac helicopter took 20 minutes to arrive. 20 minutes of applying pressure and monitoring vitals and watching a kid bleed while Elena maintained perimeter security, and Ben kept muttering, "This isn't right, this isn't right," like a prayer or a curse or both. When the bird finally lifted off with Danny secured inside, Ava stood and looked toward the darkness where Marcus's crew had disappeared. Then she looked toward the distant compound where her father was probably watching this unfold on monitors and radios, probably feeling everything she was feeling multiplied by the decades of experience that told him exactly how bad this could get. She keyed her radio, switched to the command frequency. "Ava to base. Be advised, Op 4 is not following ROE. They're mixing live rounds with sims, escalating beyond training parameters. Request immediate intervention and investigation." Tommy's voice came back, strained. "Copy, stand by." 5 minutes passed. 10. Then her father's voice, and it was different from how she'd ever heard it. Stripped of pretense. Raw with something that might have been rage, or might have been fear, or might have been the sound of a man watching everything he'd built burn down around him. "Ava, this is your father. Senator Dutch is shutting down the investigation. Says without proof it was deliberate. It's just a training accident. Marcus is claiming ammunition got mixed up in supply, clerical error. And Dutch is threatening to pull our federal contracts immediately if I don't complete the evolution as planned." The silence on the radio carried more weight than words. "So we're on our own," Ava said finally. "No," James replied, and his voice was steel-wrapped in determination. "You've never been alone. But I can't help you without making it worse. You have to finish this your way, with your team, and you have to trust that I believe in you enough to let you do it." The radio went silent, and Ava stood in the Montana darkness with her team around her and a kid's blood still on her hands, in the knowledge that the next 40 hours would determine everything. Not just whether she passed Hell Week, but whether her father's company survived, whether his reputation remained intact, whether the promise he'd made to her dying mother meant anything at all. Elena appeared beside her, checking her weapon with the practiced motions of someone who'd survived in far worse situations than this. "They tried to kill him," Elena said flatly. "This isn't about testing anymore. This is about sending a message, about breaking you publicly so Dutch can justify his decisions and Marcus can have his revenge." "I know. So what do we do?" Ava looked at her team. Ben, former cop, solid and steady. Elena, former cartel enforcer, dangerous and capable. And herself, daughter of a Delta Force legend, Marine Force Recon veteran, woman who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this moment, even if she hadn't known what form it would take. "We finish the course," Ava said. "We complete every objective. We bring everyone home. And we do it so well, so cleanly, so perfectly, that Marcus and Dutch, in Everyone watching can't deny what they're seeing. We don't just pass Hell Week, we dominate it. She keyed her radio one more time, switching to the frequency she knew her father was monitoring. I'm not quitting, Dad, and I'm not dying. I'm finishing this. For you, for Mom, for everyone who comes after me and has to face this same bullshit. I'm finishing it. In the command center, James Maddox listened to his daughter's voice and felt something break inside him and rebuild itself simultaneously. Felt the fear and pride and love and terror all mixing together until he couldn't separate them anymore. Tommy stood beside him, watching the monitors, tracking teams through the darkness. She's gonna make it, Tommy said. It wasn't a question. I know, James replied. That's what scares me. Because Marcus knows it too. And desperate men do desperate things when they see their revenge slipping away. On another monitor, Senator Dutch was making a phone call, his expression satisfied, his body language broadcasting victory already claimed. And somewhere in the Montana mountains, Marcus Kovic was giving orders to his crew, orders that wouldn't be recorded, wouldn't be official, wouldn't be anything except the kind of violence that hid in the gap between what the rules said and what actually happened when nobody was watching. The last lesson was accelerating towards something that would either forge legends or destroy them completely. And there was no going back now. There was only forward, into darkness, into uncertainty, into the kind of crucible that either refined you or reduced you to ash. The breaking point was here. The question was whether anyone would survive it intact. The 36 hours following Danny Chen's medevac became legend, whispered about in tactical training facilities for the next decade. Ava's team completed every objective, navigated every mile, survived every encounter with Marcus's increasingly aggressive OPFOR with surgical precision. They moved through the Montana wilderness like ghosts, operators who'd internalized their training so completely that it became instinct, became something deeper than conscious thought. Ben Pritchard proved to be exactly the steady presence every team needed, a former cop who'd seen enough chaos on city streets to remain calm when the mountains tried to break them. Elena Vasquez operated with cold efficiency, someone who'd learned survival in environments where mistakes meant death, where the cartel didn't give second chances or learning opportunities. And Ava pushed beyond exhaustion, beyond the point where pain had meaning, found something inside herself that her father had spent 28 years trying to cultivate. Not just skill or training or physical capability, but absolute certainty that quitting wasn't an option, that forward was the only direction that mattered. They crossed the finish line at hour 47, 11 hours ahead of the next closest team, looking like they'd been through a war, which in every way that mattered except the body count, they had. James watched them arrive from the observation deck, and the relief that flooded through him was so visceral it made his knees weak. Tommy caught his elbow, steadied him, didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. They'd both seen enough combat to recognize the difference between training evolution and actual survival situation, and what Ava's team had just endured fell firmly into the latter category. Senator Dutch stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral, but James could read the calculation happening behind those politician eyes. The mathematics of spin, of how to frame this outcome in a way that served whatever agenda he was serving. Beside him, Marcus Kovic's jaw was tight, his hands clenched, and there was something in his posture that spoke of a man watching his carefully constructed plan fall apart in real time. The compound was buzzing with activity, medical personnel checking the returning teams, instructors debriefing evolutions, cameras still rolling because Dutch had made it clear that everything needed to be documented. Tommy called formation for the candidates who'd completed the field exercise, 13 still standing out of the original 40, and the attrition rate told its own story about the difficulty level that had been imposed. Outstanding work, Tommy announced, his voice carrying the approval of someone who'd seen the reports, who knew exactly what these teams had endured. You've completed the most challenging evolution of Hell Week. You've proven you can operate under extreme stress, adapt to hostile conditions, maintain cohesion when everything's working against you. That's what separates professionals from pretenders. He paused, and James recognized the tell, the slight shift in posture that meant something was coming, something that would change the dynamic again. Final evolution begins at 1300 hours. Individual combat assessment. Each candidate will demonstrate hand-to-hand proficiency against evaluators in a controlled environment. Pass-fail based on technical skill, tactical application, and warrior mindset. 4 hours to rest, refit, and prepare. Dismissed. The formation broke, and Ava moved toward the barracks with her team, her gait slightly off from the broken rib that had gotten worse during the field exercise, from the exhaustion that had accumulated over 70 hours of Hell Week, from the weight of everything she'd been carrying since she stepped off that transport truck, what felt like a lifetime ago. James wanted to go to her, wanted to check that she was okay, wanted to be a father instead of a commander. But he stayed where he was because crossing that line now would undo everything she'd accomplished, would give Marcus and Dutch exactly the ammunition they needed. Marcus appeared beside him without warning, and his presence carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Something that spoke of desperation or determination or the particular kind of rage that came from watching your revenge slip away. "She's good," Marcus acknowledged, and it cost him something to say it. Better than good. The way she handled that field exercise, the leadership she showed, the tactical decisions under pressure. That's legitimate operator-level performance. "I know," James replied carefully, "which makes the final evolution all the more important. Individual combat assessment, no team to rely on, no terrain to use for advantage. Just her skills against evaluators who know exactly what they're doing. That's where we see if she's really got what it takes or if she's been riding on team strength." The implication was clear. Marcus had been building to this moment, setting the stage, creating the conditions for a public demonstration that would either validate everything Ava had accomplished or destroy it completely. "You're planning something," James said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus smiled, and it was genuine this time. The smile of a man who'd finally maneuvered his opponent into checkmate. "I'm planning to evaluate her fairly, using the same standards we'd apply to any candidate. That's all. If she passes, she passes. If she fails, well, that says something too, doesn't it?" He walked away, and James felt the trap closing, felt the walls of the box they'd been building for the past 3 days finally coming together with mechanical precision. Whatever was coming in the combat assessment, it wasn't going to be fair, wasn't going to follow any standard except the one Marcus invented to justify whatever outcome he'd already decided on. Tommy appeared at his shoulder, watching Marcus retreat toward where his crew was gathered near the training facility. "He's going to stack the deck," Tommy said quietly. "Multiple opponents, exhaustion protocols, something designed to break her publicly." "I know, and we can't stop him without confirming every accusation of favoritism." "I know that too. So what do we do?" James was quiet for a long moment, watching the compound through the observation deck glass, watching his daughter disappear into the barracks to grab whatever rest she could before the final evolution. Watching the cameras being positioned, the equipment being staged, the audience being assembled for whatever spectacle Marcus was orchestrating. "We trust her," James said finally. "We trust that everything I taught her, everything the Marines taught her, everything she's learned through 4 deployments and 70 hours of hell, we trust that it's enough, because that's the only option we have left." The training facility had been converted into something that looked less like a gym and more like a gladiatorial arena. Mats covering the floor, camera positions at multiple angles, seating arranged in a semicircle for observers. Senator Dutch occupied the front row with his aid and recording equipment, looking like a man attending a sporting event he'd bet heavily on. Behind him, the remaining instructor staff, the medical team on standby, and Tommy, standing with his arms crossed and his face carved from stone. James stood in the observation area above the main floor, separated by glass that felt like the barrier between dimensions, between the world where he could help his daughter and the world where he had to watch her fight alone. The first candidates went through their assessments with varying degrees of success. Some demonstrated solid fundamental skills, earning passes with room for improvement. Others struggled, their exhaustion and accumulated stress finally catching up with them, their techniques falling apart under pressure. The evaluators were professional, pushing hard but fair, testing limits without crossing into abuse. Then Marcus stepped onto the mat, and the atmosphere changed like a storm front moving in, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself feels electric and dangerous. "For our final candidate of the day," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the facility, "we're implementing a modified protocol. Given the scrutiny on this program, given the questions about standards and whether they're being maintained consistently, we want to ensure absolute fairness." He gestured to his crew, and they stepped forward in a line. Sledge Romano, massive and still carrying bruises from the field exercise. Kevin Mills, the sniper, moving with predatory grace. Luis Cortez, cocky despite the circumstances. Derek Thompson, whose eyes carried something unstable. Something that suggested the line between training and violence had become blurred. Candidate Maddox will face all four evaluators in succession, 2-minute rounds each, 30-second rest between. Full contact, scored on technical execution, tactical adaptation, and demonstration of warrior spirit. This will be the most comprehensive assessment we've conducted, and it will settle any questions about whether standards are being maintained. The words landed like a physical blow, and James felt his world narrow to a single point of focus. 4 opponents, back-to-back, after 70 hours of Hell Week, after a field exercise that had pushed her to the edge of collapse, after everything Marcus had already put her through. This wasn't assessment. This was execution dressed up in official protocol, and there was nothing James could do to stop it without confirming every accusation that had been leveled against him. Senator Dutch leaned forward in his seat, and James could see the satisfaction in his expression. The political calculus that said this outcome served his purposes regardless of how it ended. If Ava failed, it proved women couldn't handle the standards. If she somehow passed but looked weak doing it, it raised questions about program rigor. Either way, Dutch got what he wanted, and Maddox Security Solutions lost the federal contracts that meant the difference between staying in business and shutting down. Ava stepped onto the mat, and James felt his heart trying to punch through his chest. She looked smaller than usual, her 5'3" frame dwarfed by the evaluators who surrounded her, by the cameras and lights and expectations. Her movement was careful, guarded, protecting the broken rib that he knew was there, even though she'd never officially reported it. Her face was controlled, neutral. The mask she'd learned to wear when showing emotion would be interpreted as weakness. For just a moment, her eyes found his through the observation glass. And in that moment, James saw everything. Saw the 8-year-old girl learning to throw punches in their backyard. Saw the 16-year-old with cracked ribs refusing to quit the obstacle course. Saw the 23-year-old in dress blues at her mother's funeral, standing at attention while tears ran down her face. Saw every version of his daughter that had led to this moment, this test, this crucible that would define everything that came after. He pressed his hand against the glass, a gesture she couldn't possibly see from the mat, a gesture that meant nothing and everything. And then Ava turned away, focused on the evaluators, settled into a fighting stance that her father had taught her 2 decades ago and the Marines had refined into something lethal. Marcus consulted with the timekeeper, made a show of ensuring cameras were positioned correctly, building the drama, setting the stage. Then he nodded and the buzzer sounded, and Luis Cortez stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly tested. Round 1 lasted 93 seconds. Cortez came in fast and aggressive, trying to overwhelm with speed and volume, throwing combinations that looked impressive but lacked genuine threat. Ava moved like water, like smoke, slipping punches by margins so small they barely registered, conserving energy, letting him exhaust himself against her defense. At the 1-minute mark, Cortez committed to a spinning back fist, flashy and powerful and completely telegraphed. Ava ducked under it, moved to his blind side, and swept his legs with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. He went down hard, and she followed, sinking in a rear-naked choke before he could process what had happened. He tapped at 133, and the mat referee called it. The crowd murmured, surprise and recognition mixing in equal measure. Marcus's expression tightened, but he nodded, professional, accepting. Cortez stood, shook Ava's hand with grudging respect, and moved off the mat. 30 seconds of rest. Ava used it to control her breathing, to check her rib, to prepare for what was coming next. James watched her and saw the calculation happening, saw her managing resources, saw the tactical mind that he'd helped develop making decisions about energy expenditure and risk assessment. Kevin Mills stepped onto the mat for round 2, and everything changed. Where Cortez had been aggressive and obvious, Mills was patient and technical, moving like the trained operator he was, testing her defense with jabs and feints, looking for patterns, waiting for the opening that would let him impose his game plan, would turn the tide. Mills had reach, would turn the tide. Mills had reach advantage, had fresh legs, had the luxury of knowing three more opponents were waiting to exhaust her further. At the 1-minute mark, Mills shot for a takedown. Proper technique, good timing, and Ava sprawled, defended, fought for position. They went to the ground in a scramble of limbs and leverage, Mills trying to pass her guard, Ava defending with the kind of jiu-jitsu that had saved her life in Helmand Province, when hand-to-hand became the only option left. The ground fight lasted 90 seconds, both fighters demonstrating high-level grappling, neither able to establish dominant position. Then Mills made his mistake, overcommitted to a pass, left his arm extended just slightly too far. Ava trapped it, transitioned to an armbar with the fluid grace of someone who drilled the movement until it became autonomic. And Mills tapped it 2 minutes exactly. She'd won both rounds, and the crowd was starting to realize they were watching something exceptional. But she was also breathing harder now, favoring her left side where the rib was, and two more opponents were waiting. The 30-second rest felt like a heartbeat. Too fast, too brief. And then Sledge Romano stepped onto the mat, and the atmosphere shifted again. Where the previous opponents had been skilled, Sledge was simply overwhelming. 6'4", 250 pounds of muscle and aggression, moving with the confidence of someone who'd won most fights through sheer physical dominance. He came at Ava like a freight train. No finesse, just pressure and power, and the absolute certainty that his size advantage would be decisive. Ava tried to move, to circle, to use footwork to mitigate his strength, but Sledge cut off angles, herded her toward the corner of the mat, imposed his game plan through relentless forward pressure. At 45 seconds, he caught her. A body shot that connected with her injured rib, and James saw the pain lance through her, saw her guard drop for just a fraction of a second. Sledge followed with a takedown that slammed her into the mat with enough force to bounce, and then he was in her guard, raining down punches that the referee should have stopped but didn't. Ava covered up, absorbed punishment that turned her face into a mask of bruises and blood, and for a moment James was watching his daughter being beaten while he stood behind glass and could do nothing. Absolutely nothing except trust that she would find a way through it. And she did. At 1 minute 30, with Sledge committed to ground and pound, focused on the violence, Ava got her legs positioned, trapped his arm, and went for a triangle choke from the bottom. It was desperation technique, low percentage against someone with Sledge's size and strength, but she locked it in tight, squeezed with everything she had left, cut off the blood flow to his brain. Sledge tried to posture up, to slam his way out, but Ava held on like she was welded there. Like releasing wasn't an option her body would accept. His punches got weaker, his movements less coordinated, and at 1:58, he went limp. The referee called it, pulled Ava off, and Sledge collapsed onto the mat unconscious. Medical personnel rushed in, tended to Sledge while Ava rolled onto her side, coughing blood, trying to breathe through what was clearly a punctured lung now, not just a broken rib. James's hand was pressed so hard against the observation glass that his fingers were white, bloodless, and Tommy was beside him saying something that didn't register, because all James could hear was the roaring in his ears and his daughter's labored breathing through the facility speakers. The 30-second rest was a joke. Ava couldn't stand without help, couldn't breathe without visible pain, and Derek Thompson was stepping onto the mat with an expression that said he was going to finish what Sledge had started. Marcus moved to the center of the mat, consulted with the referee, made a show of checking the rules, then he nodded, and the timekeeper prepared to start round 4, and James finally broke. He moved toward the door of the observation room, ready to stop this, ready to end it regardless of consequences, ready to be the father instead of the commander. But Tommy was there, blocking his path, and his voice was steel-wrapped in understanding. If you stop this now, you destroy everything she's fighting for, everything she's proven, everything she is. She can't continue. Look at her. I am looking at her, and I see a warrior who's not done yet. I see your daughter, who's got more of you in her than you ever wanted to admit. And I see someone who would never forgive you if you took this away from her. James looked back at the mat, at Ava using the ropes to pull herself upright, at the determination in her posture despite the damage, despite the pain, despite every rational reason to quit. And he saw Sarah in that moment, saw his wife in the hospital bed saying, "Let her fly, let her fall, let her learn." The buzzer sounded for round 4. Derek Thompson came in cautious at first, having watched what happened to his teammates. But his caution dissolved quickly into aggression as he realized Ava was hurt, was compromised, was vulnerable in ways she hadn't been in the previous rounds. He pressed forward with combinations that targeted her injured side, that made her back up, that pushed her toward the edge of the mat and the edge of her ability to continue. At 30 seconds, Ava's legs gave out. Not from a takedown, not from a technique, just from accumulated exhaustion and damage, and the simple fact that the human body has limits and she'd exceeded hers. She went down to one knee, and Thompson moved in for the finish, and James heard himself make a sound that was part prayer and part curse, and part the kind of anguish that came from watching someone you love suffer and being powerless to stop it. But Ava wasn't done. As Thompson closed distance, she exploded upward from her kneeling position, everything she had left channeled into a single technique that her father had taught her when she was 12 years old. A uppercut to the solar plexus, precisely placed, perfectly timed, all her remaining power focused into one strike. Thompson's forward momentum added to the impact, and the combination stopped him cold, drove the air from his lungs, sent him staggering backward with his hands dropping, his guard completely compromised. Ava followed, moving on instinct now, on muscle memory, on something deeper than conscious thought. She swept his legs, identical technique to the first round, but executed with the desperation of someone who knew this was the last card she had to play. Thompson went down, and Ava transitioned to an arm bar before he could recover. Hyperextended his elbow to the point of dislocation, and he screamed, tapped frantically, but she held it for another second, making absolutely certain he knew she could have broken it if she'd wanted to. The referee pulled her off at 1 minute 42, and Ava collapsed onto her back, chest heaving, blood on her face and mat, but conscious, aware, and victorious. The facility was silent for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then someone started clapping. One person, slow and deliberate, and James looked down to see it was Ben Pritchard, the former cop from Ava's field exercise team. Then Elena joined him, and Danny Chen, who'd been discharged from the hospital and had come back to watch, and then more people, and more, until the entire facility was on its feet, applauding something they'd never seen before and might never see again. 4 opponents defeated in 7 minutes and 43 seconds of the most brutal combat assessment anyone present had ever witnessed. Not pretty, not easy, but absolute and undeniable and impossible to dismiss or diminish. Marcus stood at the edge of the mat, his clipboard hanging forgotten in his hand, his expression cycling through shock and disbelief in something that might have been respect or might have been the recognition that his revenge had failed, that all his planning and manipulation had accomplished nothing except making Ava's victory more legendary. Senator Dutch was no longer sitting. He was standing, phone to his ear, having what was clearly an intense conversation with someone, and his body language broadcast defeat and damage control in equal measure. James finally moved, no longer caring about protocol or perception or any of the constraints that had bound him for the past 72 hours. He left the observation room and headed for the facility floor, Tommy right behind him, and they arrived just as the medical team was checking Ava over, just as she was trying to sit up despite their protests. "Don't move," the medic said firmly. "Possible punctured lung, broken ribs, facial contusions. You need imaging and proper treatment." Ava's eyes found her father, and she smiled despite the blood and pain and exhaustion. "Did I pass?" she asked, her voice rough but clear. James dropped to his knees beside the mat, not caring who saw, not caring what it looked like, just needing to be close to her, needing to touch her shoulder and confirm she was alive and whole in the ways that mattered. "You passed 15 years ago, baby girl. I just couldn't see it until now." The facility doors burst open, and federal agents in tactical gear flooded in, moving with practiced efficiency, securing positions, establishing control. Tommy had his phone out, and his expression was grim satisfaction mixed with vindication. "I called the FBI 4 hours ago," Tommy said to James quietly. "Told them about Danny's shooting, about the mixed ammunition, about Marcus's harassment. Gave them everything Elena had been collecting as evidence while she was pretending to work for Dutch. Marcus turned to run and found agents blocking his path. His crew was already being secured, hands behind their backs, rights being read. Senator Dutch was arguing with the lead agent, his voice rising, his careful politician mask cracking to reveal the panic underneath. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the kind of presence that came from 2 decades of federal law enforcement, approached James and extended her hand. "Colonel Maddox, I'm Special Agent Reeves, FBI. We've been building a case against Senator Dutch for 6 months. Contractor, fraud, bribery, conspiracy. Your friend Mr. Castellano's call this morning gave us probable cause to move now. We're arresting Marcus Kovic and his associates for attempted murder, assault, and conspiracy. Senator Dutch is being detained for questioning regarding his involvement." She looked down at Ava and something in her expression softened. "For what it's worth, that was the most impressive thing I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement. You're going to be okay." The medics were loading Ava onto a stretcher, preparing for transport, but she grabbed James's hand before they could wheel her away. "The company," she said, "the contracts. Don't worry about that now. Dad, the company." James squeezed her hand gently, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every decision he'd made over the past 72 hours, every moment of doubt and fear and ultimate faith. "The company will survive or it won't, but you're alive, and you proved everything you needed to prove. And that matters more than any contract or reputation or legacy I thought I was building. Your mother was right. I had to let you fly. And watching you fight today, I finally understood what she meant." Ava's eyes were closing, exhaustion and adrenaline crash and pain medication all combining to pull her under. But before she lost consciousness completely, she whispered something that only James heard. "I love you too, Dad." The facility cleared slowly, people processing what they'd witnessed, federal agents conducting interviews and gathering evidence, the machinery of justice grinding into motion with all its bureaucratic weight. James rode with Ava in the ambulance to the hospital, Tommy following behind in his truck, and for the first time in 72 hours, James felt like he could breathe. In the observation room, forgotten in the chaos, a single camera had continued recording. The footage would eventually make its way to YouTube, posted anonymously by someone who understood that some stories needed to be told, that some moments of human courage and determination and refusal to quit deserved a wider audience. Within 72 hours, the video would have 10 million views. Within a week, 50 million. People around the world would watch Ava Maddox face 4 opponents and refuse to break, would see her father watching from behind glass, unable to help, would hear the story of corruption and revenge and the price of standing up for what you believe in. But in the ambulance, none of that mattered yet. In the ambulance, there was just a father holding his daughter's hand, watching her breathe, and being grateful for every breath because he'd come so close to losing her, and the universe had been merciful enough to let him keep her a little longer. "You raised a hell of a Marine," Tommy said from the front seat. "I raised a hell of a woman," James corrected. "The Marine part she did herself." The Montana landscape rolled past the ambulance windows, mountains and trees and sky that looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago, when 40 candidates had arrived believing they knew what Hell Week meant. But everything was different now. Everything had changed. The storm had passed, and what remained was the kind of clarity that only came from surviving something that should have destroyed you. The last lesson had been learned, though not by the people Marcus or Dutch had intended. The lesson was simple and profound and had been waiting to be discovered all along. Strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up. It was about trusting the people you loved to fight their own battles. It was about letting go while still being there to catch them if they fell. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people you were trying to protect turned out to be protecting you right back. The ambulance rolled on toward the hospital, carrying a daughter who'd proven herself beyond any doubt, and a father who'd finally learned what his wife had tried to teach him 5 years ago on her deathbed. The storm was over. The breaking point had been reached and survived. And what came next would be built on the foundation of what they'd endured together, even when they were apart. The last lesson was complete, and the legacy it created would outlive them all. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and institutional failure. That particular combination of cleaning products and recycled air that existed nowhere except in places where people went to heal from things that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Ava had been unconscious for 18 hours. Surgery to repair the punctured lung, pins in 2 ribs, treatment for the concussion and facial trauma, and the accumulated damage from 72 hours of Hell Week culminating in 8 minutes of violence that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. James sat in the chair beside her bed, the same chair he'd occupied for 6 months while Sarah died, And the parallel was so obvious it felt like the universe was testing him, asking if he'd learned anything. If watching one woman he loved fight for breath had taught him about the cost of control and the necessity of letting go. Tommy brought coffee at dawn, the kind of terrible hospital vending machine coffee that tasted like regret and exhaustion, but contained enough caffeine to keep a man functional when sleep wasn't an option. FBI finished processing the scene, Tommy reported, settling into the chair on the other side of Ava's bed. They found the mixed ammunition, documented the sabotage, got statements from candidates about harassment and intimidation. Marcus and his crew are in federal custody. Dutch is trying to lawyer up, but the evidence is pretty damning. What about the company? James asked, though part of him didn't care anymore. Part of him had watched his daughter nearly die and realized that contracts and reputation and legacy meant nothing if the people you loved weren't there to share it. That's complicated, Tommy said carefully. The video went viral. 10 million views in the first 24 hours, still climbing. People are calling Ava a hero, calling you everything from enabler to saint depending on their politics. Social media is tearing itself apart, arguing about whether you did the right thing letting her continue or should have stopped it. The usual circus. James looked at his daughter, at the tubes and monitors and bandages that mapped the cost of proving herself, and he felt old. Not 60 years old, ancient. The kind of old that came from watching too many people get hurt, too many missions go wrong, too many moments where the right decision and the safe decision diverged and you had to choose, knowing someone would pay the price either way. What does she get from this? James asked quietly. A viral video? Internet fame that'll disappear in a week when the next outrage comes along? That's not what she fought for. No, Tommy agreed, but what she fought for, she got. Respect. Proof that gender doesn't determine capability. A story that'll be told in training facilities and locker rooms, and anywhere people talk about refusing to quit when quitting makes sense. That's worth something. Maybe not worth what it cost, but worth something. The door opened, and Elena Vasquez entered with the kind of confidence that came from having federal credentials now, from being elevated from suspected criminal informant to cooperating witness to something approaching hero in the span of 72 hours. She carried a folder thick with documents and the expression of someone who'd seen the machinery of justice from the inside and wasn't entirely impressed with what she'd found. FBI wants statements from both of you, Elena said without preamble. They're building the case against Dutch and Marcus, need corroboration on timeline and intent. I told them you'd cooperate after Ava wakes up and you've had time to process everything. What are they charging Marcus with? James asked. Attempted murder, assault with intent, conspiracy to commit fraud, witness intimidation, about 15 other counts. The prosecutor says they're looking at 20 years minimum, possibly more if they can prove Dutch was directly involved in ordering the violence rather than just the contract manipulation. Elena pulled up a chair, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment, watching Ava breathe through the oxygen mask, watching the monitors track her vital signs with electronic precision. I need to tell you something, Elena said finally, about why I was really there, why I agreed to work with the FBI. James turned to look at her, and something in his expression must have warned her that whatever she was about to say needed to be honest, needed to be complete, because this wasn't the time for half-truths or strategic omissions. My sister Maria, she wanted to be a federal agent, grew up in the cartel territories, watched what they did to people, wanted to be the one who stopped it. She made it through the academy, got assigned to border operations, was damn good at her job. Then she got pregnant, requested desk duty for the duration, and her supervisor told her if she couldn't handle field work, maybe she should find another career. Elena's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that spoke of old wounds and older rage. She went back to field work at 6 months pregnant because she thought she had to prove she could handle it, got caught in a crossfire during a raid, took 3 rounds to the vest and 1 to the leg. Survived but lost the baby. Quit the FBI a month later. Drank herself to death over the next 2 years. I watched her destroy herself because someone made her feel like she had to choose between being a woman and being an agent, between having a family and being taken seriously. She looked at Ava at the evidence of what proving yourself cost. When Dutch approached me, offered me money to gather dirt on your program, I went to the FBI instead. Told them I'd wear a wire, document everything, help them build a case. Not just against Dutch, but against the whole system that makes women like my sister feel like they have to break themselves to be accepted. That makes women like your daughter fight 4 men after 70 hours of hell just to prove they belong. James was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications, understanding that this had been bigger than personal revenge or contract disputes, that Elena had been fighting a different war altogether, one that had started long before Ava stepped off that transport truck and would continue long after she left the hospital. "Thank you," he said it finally, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. For helping her, for helping all of them. The door opened again, and this time it was Special Agent Reeves, looking like she'd had about as much sleep as James, which was to say none at all. She nodded to the room, professional courtesy, mixed with something that might have been sympathy. "Colonel Maddox, we need to discuss the status of your federal contracts. The Pentagon is convening a review board, and Senator Dutch's office has filed an emergency injunction claiming your program represents a danger to participants and should be suspended pending investigation." James felt the last pieces of his professional life crumbling, felt the company he'd built over 15 years dissolving like sand in water, and discovered he didn't care as much as he thought he would. "Let them review," he said. "Let them investigate. Every decision I made, every protocol I followed, it's all documented. If they want to destroy the company because we refuse to participate in a corrupt politician's schemes, that tells you everything you need to know about the system." "The system is bigger than one politician," Reeves replied carefully. "Dutch is connected to a network. 12 senators, 8 defense contractors, all working together to maintain certain arrangements that benefit them financially. Your daughter's video, it's exposing things people wanted to stay hidden. That makes you both targets." She pulled out her phone, showed them footage that had been captured by the facility cameras and leaked, probably by one of Dutch's people trying to spin the narrative before the FBI could control it. The video showed Ava's fight from multiple angles, showed her getting beaten, showed her refusing to quit, showed her father watching from behind glass with his hand pressed against it like he could somehow reach through and help. The comments section was a war zone. Half the internet calling Ava the toughest woman they had ever seen, calling James a hero for trusting her, demanding justice for what had been done to her. The other half claiming it was staged, claiming no woman could really do that, claiming James should have stopped it and was guilty of negligence or worse. "Public opinion is split," Reeves continued, "which means politically this could go either way. The Pentagon might decide supporting you is worth the controversy, or they might decide you're too hot to touch and cut ties completely. Depends on how the next 72 hours play out in the media." "I don't care about the media," James said. "I care about my daughter waking up. Everything else can wait." But everything else couldn't wait, and over the next 48 hours, the world made that abundantly clear. The hospital became a siege. Reporters camped outside trying to get statements or photographs or any scrap of information they could package into content. Social media exploded with hashtags and hot takes and the kind of performative outrage that substituted for actual understanding. Politicians who'd never worn a uniform or heard a shot fired in anger suddenly had strong opinions about training standards and gender integration and whether James Maddox was a visionary or a criminal. The company started hemorrhaging contracts. 15 clients pulled out in the first day, spooked by the controversy, worried about association with the program under federal investigation. Even Tommy's reassurances that the FBI was investigating Dutch, not Maddox Security Solutions, couldn't overcome the fundamental reality that controversy was bad for business and perception mattered more than facts. By hour 60, James was looking at bankruptcy. By hour 70, he was looking at closing the company entirely and letting go of the 40 people who trusted him with their careers. And through it all, Ava slept, her body fighting its own battle, healing from damage that would leave scars both visible and hidden, preparing to wake up to a world that had transformed while she was unconscious. She finally opened her eyes at hour 73, and the first thing she saw was her father still sitting in that chair, looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. Her voice came out rough, damaged by the breathing tube they'd removed 6 hours earlier. "Dad." James was at her side immediately, his hand finding hers with the desperate relief of someone who'd been preparing for the worst and couldn't quite believe they'd gotten something better. "Hey, baby girl, welcome back." "Did I pass?" James laughed, and it was half sob, half genuine amusement at the fact that his daughter had been in surgery and unconscious for 3 days, and her first question was about whether she'd passed Hell Week. You passed everything, dominated it, became an internet legend, and possibly destroyed my company in the process. Ava's eyes sharpened, clarity cutting through the fog of pain medication and recovery. What happened? Tommy appeared on her other side, and together he and James filled her in. The FBI investigation, the arrests, the media firestorm, the contracts being canceled, the Pentagon review, all of it delivered in the careful tones of people trying not to overwhelm someone who'd just woken up from serious medical trauma. When they finished, Ava was quiet for a long moment, processing, calculating, and James recognized the expression because it was the same one he wore when making tactical decisions under pressure. We need to testify, she said finally, not just give statements to the FBI, public testimony, congressional hearing, make them look at what Dutch and Marcus did, make them explain why they thought it was acceptable. Use the attention while we have it. You just had surgery, James protested. You need to recover, not throw yourself into a political fight. I've been recovering my whole life, Ava replied, and there was steel in her voice now. The same steel that had carried her through 4 deployments in 72 hours of hell. Recovering from people telling me I'm too small, too weak, too female. I'm done recovering. I'm done proving myself over and over while the system stays broken. If my fight matters, if those 8 minutes meant anything, then we use them to change things. Elena had been standing near the door, listening, and now she stepped forward with the intensity of someone who'd found a kindred spirit. She's right. Dutch isn't the disease. He's the symptom. There's a whole network of politicians and contractors who profit from maintaining barriers, from ensuring certain people stay out of certain positions. The FBI can prosecute Dutch, but unless someone forces the conversation, unless someone makes the public actually look at the system, nothing changes. James looked at his daughter, at the bandages and bruises and the determination in her eyes that he recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror 1,000 times. Had seen it in Sarah when she was fighting cancer and refused to give up even when the doctors said there was no hope left. Your mother told me to let you fly, James said quietly, but she didn't tell me what to do when you chose to fly into a storm. She told you to trust me, Ava replied, so trust me now. Trust that I know what I'm doing and that this matters more than a company or contracts or any legacy we thought we were building. The hearing was scheduled for 7 days later, enough time for Ava to be discharged from the hospital, but not enough time for the media attention to die down, for the controversy to fade into the background noise of the 24-hour news cycle. Congressional hearings were usually dry affairs, bureaucratic theater performed for C-SPAN cameras and staffers taking notes. But this one was different from the moment Ava walked into the chamber. She moved carefully, still healing, wearing dress blues that couldn't quite hide the fact that she was injured, that she'd paid a physical price for being there. The gallery was packed, standing room only, cameras from every major network and half the internet. Senator Dutch sat at the defendant's table with his lawyers, looking diminished somehow, smaller than he'd seemed at the compound when he'd held all the power and made all the rules. The committee chairman, a gray-haired senator from Virginia, who'd actually served in Vietnam and knew the difference between political theater and genuine testimony, called the hearing to order with more gravity than usual. We're here to investigate allegations of corruption, fraud, and abuse within federal contractor oversight, he announced, specifically regarding Senator Richard Dutch's involvement with private military companies and the manipulation of evaluation standards for personal and financial gain. James testified first, laying out the timeline with military precision. The contract bidding process, Dutch's pressure to fail female candidates, Marcus Kovic's arrival with his history and grudge, the escalating harassment, the mixed ammunition, the injuries, all of it documented and supported by FBI evidence in witness statements. The opposing senators, the ones Dutch had probably called in favors with, tried to paint James as negligent, as someone who'd put his daughter in danger for publicity, as a commander who'd lost control of his program and was now trying to blame others for his failures. James took it all with the calm of someone who'd been shot at by people far more threatening than politicians with talking points. And when they were done, he delivered his response with the kind of measured intensity that made even the hostile senators sit back in their chairs. I spent 35 years in Delta Force protecting this country from threats foreign and domestic. I've made decisions that cost lives, that haunted me, that I'd change if I could. But letting my daughter prove herself wasn't one of them. What happened at my compound wasn't a failure of oversight. It was a deliberate attempt by Senator Dutch and his associates to destroy a program that threatened their financial interests. They weaponized evaluation standards, endangered lives, and when that didn't work, they tried to cover it up. He looked directly at Dutch, and the contempt in his expression was impossible to miss. You came after my daughter because you thought she was my weakness. You were wrong. She's my strength, and she's about to show you what that means. Ava took the stand 3 hours into the hearing, after expert witnesses and FBI agents and lawyers had laid the technical groundwork, after the committee was drowning in facts and figures and legal arguments. She sat in the witness chair looking small and injured and absolutely unbreakable. And when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the chamber and every screen where people were watching live. My name is Captain Ava Maddox, United States Marine Corps Force Recon. 4 deployments, 3 Purple Hearts, Navy Commendation Medal with Valor. I tell you this not to brag, but to establish that I'm not some diversity hire or publicity stunt. I'm an operator who's proven myself in actual combat, under fire, in conditions that would break most people regardless of gender. She paused, and the chamber was silent enough to hear the cameras clicking. I participated in Hell Week at Maddox Security Solutions because I wanted to join my father's company as an operator, not as the boss's daughter getting a desk job. I knew it would be hard. I expected to be tested. What I didn't expect was to be targeted for elimination by people who believed my success would threaten their financial interests. The questioning began, and the opposing senators tried to paint her as reckless, as someone who'd ignored safety protocols, as a woman who'd pushed too hard trying to prove a point and gotten hurt as a result. But Ava had spent 4 deployments being questioned by officers who outranked her and contractors who didn't trust her, and she knew how to hold her ground. Senator, with respect, being tested hard isn't the problem. Every operator should be tested to their limits. The problem is when the test is designed not to evaluate capability, but to ensure failure. When ammunition gets mixed, when harassment becomes assault, when a training evolution becomes an assassination attempt, that's not standards. That's sabotage. She looked at Dutch, and there was something in her expression that made the former senator flinch. You tried to break me because you thought women don't belong in combat positions. You tried to destroy my father's company because it threatened contractors you had financial relationships with. And when your plan failed, when I refused to quit, you tried to spin it as unsafe training instead of acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, your assumptions about what women can do were wrong. One of the friendly senators, a woman from California who'd been pushing for military reform, leaned forward with obvious interest. Captain Maddox, in your professional opinion, based on 4 deployments in 72 hours of what's been described as the most intensive evaluation ever documented, what needs to change? Ava was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully, knowing that this was the moment that mattered, that everything she'd endured was leading to this chance to say something that might actually change the system. Standards matter. They should be high, they should be objective, they should test actual capability rather than arbitrary measures that favor certain body types or backgrounds. But standards become weapons when they're manipulated by people who profit from exclusion. What needs to change is accountability. When evaluation becomes harassment, when testing becomes torture, when politics infiltrates programs designed to identify the best operators regardless of who they are, someone needs to face consequences. Real consequences. Not just getting shuffled to another position or retiring with full benefits. She gestured to the evidence binder stacked on the committee table. The FBI documented everything. You have the proof. You have the witnesses. You have a viral video watched by 50 million people showing exactly what happened. The question isn't whether Senator Dutch and his associates are guilty. The question is whether this committee has the courage to hold them accountable and implement reforms that prevent it from happening again. The hearing continued for another 4 hours, but that moment was the one that would be replayed on news channels and social media, that would be excerpted and analyzed and debated. Ava Maddox, injured but unbroken, calling out a corrupt system while the people who tried to destroy her watched impotently. The verdict came 3 days later. Senator Richard Dutch was censured by the Senate and forced to resign, facing criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. His defense contractor relationships were exposed and terminated, costing the companies involved nearly $800 million in suspended contracts. Marcus Kovic and his crew pled guilty to reduced charges, facing between 8 and 15 years in federal prison. But the real victory wasn't the prosecutions, it was the reforms. The Pentagon announced a comprehensive review of contractor evaluation standards, implemented new oversight protocols, established an independent board to investigate complaints of harassment or manipulation. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't solve everything, but it was more than had existed before. And Maddox Security Solutions, which had been hemorrhaging contracts and heading toward bankruptcy, found itself in an unexpected position. The publicity that had nearly destroyed them became their greatest asset. New clients reached out, companies and organizations that wanted to be associated with a program that had been tested in the most public way possible and proven legitimate. Within a month, they had more contracts than they could handle. But James made a decision that surprised even Tommy. He scaled back the company, downsized to a lean operation focused on quality over quantity, on training rather than deployment, on being the kind of program that developed operators instead of just certifying them. It meant less money, less prestige, less empire, but more integrity, more purpose, more alignment with what Sarah had tried to tell him before she died. That legacy wasn't about building something big. It was about building something that mattered. The final piece of the reckoning came on a cold morning 6 weeks after the hearing, when James drove to the federal prison in Colorado where Marcus Kovic was being held pending trial. Tommy had advised against it. Elena had questioned his motives. Even Ava had seemed uncertain about what her father hoped to accomplish. But James went anyway, because there were things that needed to be said, conversations that needed to happen, and he'd learned enough over the past 2 months to understand that closure sometimes required confronting the people who'd hurt you. Marcus looked older in the orange jumpsuit, diminished somehow without the tactical gear and attitude, stripped down to just a man who'd made terrible choices and was paying the price. They sat across from each other in the visitor room with bulletproof glass between them and phones connecting their voices and 15 years of history making the air feel heavy. "Why are you here?" Marcus asked, and he sounded tired, genuinely curious rather than hostile. "To tell you I'm sorry," James replied, and watched Marcus's expression shift from suspicion to confusion. "For what? I'm the one who tried to destroy your daughter, for not seeing that you were in pain. After the court-martial, after your career ended, I convinced myself you deserved it, that justice had been served. I never considered that maybe you needed help, that maybe what happened in Afghanistan broke something in you that never healed. I was so focused on being right that I stopped caring about what was true." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried emotion that had been absent before. "I told myself I was protecting standards, maintaining integrity, making sure weak people didn't get positions where they'd get others killed. But that was just cover. Truth is, I was trying to make you feel what I felt when you testified against me. The helplessness, the rage, the sense that everything you'd built was being destroyed by someone who claimed they were doing the right thing." He looked down at his hands, at the cuffs that held them together. "Your daughter, she's everything I claimed she couldn't be. Tough, skilled, resilient, legitimate. Watching her refuse to quit while I kept trying to break her, I realized I wasn't protecting anything. I was just hurting people because I was hurt, and that's the definition of being a coward." James felt something release in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying for 15 years without realizing it. "We both made mistakes. The difference is you're getting the chance to learn from yours, to become something better. I brought you something." He slid papers through the slot beneath the glass, forms and applications that Marcus picked up with confusion turning to recognition. "Clemency petition," James explained. "I can't guarantee it'll be approved, but I'm supporting your request for reduced sentence with mandatory counseling and rehabilitation. You serve your time, you do the work to address the trauma and anger. You get out in 8 years instead of 15, and you get the chance to do something constructive with what you learned." "Why would you do this?" "Because my wife taught me before she died that holding on to anger just poisons you from the inside. Because my daughter showed me that strength includes knowing when to extend mercy. And because I believe people can change if they're given the reason and the opportunity." James stood, preparing to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped him. "Tell your daughter I'm sorry for everything, and tell her she's the toughest operator I ever faced, and I've faced a lot over 20 years. "Tell her yourself," James replied. "You get out in 8 years, you come find us, you can apologize in person. And maybe if you've done the work, we can help you find purpose instead of revenge. The drive back to Montana took 6 hours, and James spent them thinking about the past 2 months, about everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. His company was smaller but stronger. His daughter was injured but whole. His reputation was complicated but honest. And the promise he'd made to Sarah, the one that had haunted him for 5 years, he'd finally figured out how to keep it. Let her fly. Let her fall. Let her learn. But always let her know you're proud. He'd done all of that, even when it terrified him, even when it meant watching her suffer, even when every instinct screamed to intervene and protect and control. And in doing so, he discovered that the last lesson wasn't just for Ava. It was for him too, about trust and faith and the difference between protecting someone and imprisoning them in your fear. The Montana compound came into view as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in gold and amber, and James could see lights in the training facility where the next class of candidates was preparing for their own Hell Week. Ava was there, he knew, not as a candidate this time, but as an instructor, teaching the lessons she'd learned through pain and persistence and refusal to quit. Tommy met him at the entrance, 2 beers in hand, because some traditions mattered even when everything else changed. How'd it go with Marcus? Better than expected, worse than hoped for, somewhere in between where most truth lives. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the candidates through the windows, watching the next generation prepare to prove themselves. You did good, Tommy said finally. With all of it, Sarah would be proud. Sarah would tell me I'm an idiot who took too long to figure out what she'd been trying to teach me, James replied. But she'd be proud anyway, that's who she was. Inside the facility, Ava was demonstrating a technique to a group of candidates, moving carefully but confidently. Her body healed enough to function even if it would carry scars forever. She caught sight of her father through the window and smiled, and in that smile, James saw everything. Past and present and future, pain and triumph, and the kind of love that survived everything the world threw at it. The reckoning was complete. The accounts had been settled, and what remained was the work of building something better on the foundation of what they'd survived. The last lesson had been learned, and the legacy it created would outlive them all. 3 years passed like water through cupped hands, fast and slow simultaneously, each day blending into the next until you looked back and couldn't quite believe how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. The Montana compound still stood against the mountains like a challenge carved from timber and stone, still welcomed candidates who thought they knew what they were capable of and needed 72 hours to discover the truth. But everything was different now. The training protocols had been rewritten, incorporating lessons learned at a cost measured in broken ribs and punctured lungs and viral videos that had been watched by over 100 million people worldwide. The oversight board met quarterly, independent evaluators with no financial stake in outcomes, ensuring that what happened with Marcus Kovich and Senator Dutch would never happen again, or at least would be caught before it escalated to attempted murder. James stood in the observation deck on a November morning that looked identical to the one 3 years ago when his daughter had stepped off a transport truck and into a hell that would transform them both. He was 63 now, and the years showed in the gray that had overtaken his hair completely, in the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions, and the particular weight that came from being proven right at a cost you'd never wanted to pay. Below, 40 new candidates were forming up for their initial briefing, and among them were 8 women, a number that would have been unthinkable before Ava's fight became the story that every female operator in the country knew by heart. They stood at attention with the same nervous energy their predecessors had carried, the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty, the same belief that they were ready for something they couldn't possibly be ready for until they'd endured it. Tommy appeared beside him with coffee because some rituals were sacred and some friendships didn't need words most of the time. New class looks solid, Tommy observed. Diverse backgrounds, strong credentials, proper motivation. The kind of candidates we actually want instead of the kind who showed up because they thought it would be easy money or resume padding. Ava's briefing them in 20 minutes, James said. She wanted me to watch. You watched her do this 50 times over the past 3 years. What makes today different? James didn't answer immediately, just watched the candidates below. Watched the way they moved and interacted and sized each other up the way people always did when they were about to be tested and didn't know if they'd measure up. Today's different because I finally understand what Sarah was trying to tell me. about legacy, about what matters, about the difference between building something for yourself and building something that outlives you. The briefing room had been renovated since the incident, new equipment and updated technology, but the fundamentals remained the same. Concrete floor, harsh lighting, the kind of space that made comfort impossible and focus mandatory. The candidates sat in formation, and at the front of the room, Ava Maddox stood in tactical instructor gear that hid most of the scars but couldn't hide the way she moved, careful and deliberate, the permanent reminders of what proving yourself could cost. She'd been teaching for 3 years now, and she'd become something her father had never quite managed to be. Not just an instructor who taught techniques, but a leader who understood that training warriors meant addressing the whole person, the fears and doubts and trauma that came with choosing a profession where violence was the job description and consequences were permanent. "My name is Ava Maddox," she began, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned every syllable through experience that couldn't be faked or borrowed. "Some of you know my story. Some of you probably watched the video that brought you here, that made you think you wanted to try this. That video shows 8 minutes of my life. What it doesn't show is the 15 years of training before those 8 minutes, or the 3 years of recovery and reflection after them." She moved across the front of the room, and James recognized the teaching style because it was his own, adapted and refined, made more effective through Ava's particular understanding of how people learned when their survival depended on it. Hell Week will test everything you think you know about yourself, your physical limits, your mental toughness, your ability to function when every system is screaming at you to quit. Some of you will discover you're stronger than you believed. Most of you will discover you're exactly as strong as you are, which might not be enough. A few of you will surprise everyone, including yourselves. One of the female candidates, a former Army Ranger named Jessica Torres, who'd been decorated for valor in 3 deployments, raised her hand with the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to prove except to herself. "Ma'am, how do we know if we're ready? How do we know we're not going to crack when it matters?" Ava smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd asked herself the same question 1,000 times and finally found an answer she could live with. "You don't, that's the point. If you knew you were ready, you wouldn't need to be tested. The uncertainty is what makes it real, what makes it matter. Your job isn't to know you'll succeed. Your job is to try anyway, to commit fully to the attempt, and to learn from whatever happens regardless of the outcome." She paused, and the room was silent in the way that meant people were actually listening, actually processing, actually understanding that they were being taught something that transcended technique or protocol. "3 years ago, I thought Hell Week was about proving I belonged, about showing my father and everyone else that gender didn't determine capability. I was wrong. Hell Week isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about discovering who you are when everything comfortable gets stripped away and all that's left is the core of what makes you human. Some of you will find strength there. Some will find weakness. Most will find both, and that's when the real learning begins." The briefing continued for another hour, covering logistics and medical protocols and the evolution schedule that would determine who stayed and who quit. But that opening, that moment of genuine vulnerability and wisdom, that was what the candidates would remember when they were suffering through drownproofing or ruck marches or whatever evolution pushed them closest to their breaking point. After the candidates were dismissed to prepare their gear, Ava found her father in the observation deck, and they stood together watching the organized chaos below, watching people who didn't yet know what they were capable of preparing to find out. "You did good," James said quietly. "Better than I ever did at briefings. You made them understand it's not about the company or the contract or the career. It's about them. That's the lesson I never quite figured out how to teach." "You taught me," Ava replied. "Just took me getting nearly killed to understand what you were saying." They were quiet for a moment, father and daughter sharing space without needing to fill it with words, comfortable in the silence that came from 3 years of rebuilding trust and understanding, and the particular bond that forms when you survive something traumatic together. "I got a call from the prison yesterday," James said. "Marcus is being released next month, 8 years reduced to 5 for good behavior and completion of rehabilitation programs. He wants to know if the offer still stands." "What offer?" "I told him when he got out, if he'd done the work, we'd help him find purpose instead of revenge, give him a chance to teach instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy." Ava considered this, and James could see the calculation happening, the weighing of risk against potential, justice against mercy, the easy answer against the right one. He tried to kill me, she said finally. Came as close as anyone ever has to succeeding. Part of me says he doesn't deserve a second chance, that some things are unforgivable. And the other part? The other part remembers that he was broken by a system that never helped him heal, that punished him without offering rehabilitation, that threw him away when he could have been rebuilt into something better. The other part thinks maybe we break the cycle by being better than the people who hurt us. She turned to face her father fully, and in her eyes James saw Sarah, saw the compassion and strength and absolute refusal to let bitterness poison everything it touched. If he's serious about changing, about doing the work, then yeah, the offer stands, but he comes here as a probationary instructor, earns his place same as everyone else, and the first sign he's backsliding, he's gone. No second chances for the second chance. James felt something settle in his chest, some weight he'd been carrying without realizing it. The question of whether extending mercy made him weak or made him wise finally answered in a way he could accept. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. Hell, I'm proud of you, not because of what you survived or what you proved, because of who you became after all that was done. The next few weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of Hell Week, candidates being tested and failing and succeeding and discovering things about themselves they'd never known. The 8 female candidates handled themselves with varying degrees of success, 3 making it through the full 72 hours, which was a better ratio than the male candidates and sparked exactly the kind of conversation Ava had hoped for about capability versus assumption. Jessica Torres, the former ranger, dominated every evolution with the quiet competence of someone who'd been doing this work since before it was politically acceptable for women to do it officially. She finished Hell Week ranked second in her class, would have been first except for a navigation error on the field exercise that cost her team 30 minutes, and accepted the results with the grace of someone who understood that perfect didn't exist, and excellent was achievement enough. On the final day, as the remaining candidates stood in formation for their completion ceremony, James stood beside Ava and Tommy and Elena, who'd become a permanent fixture at the compound after the FBI had officially cleared her, and she decided that teaching others to survive was better than surviving alone. 22 completed out of 40 starters, Tommy announced, his voice carrying the approval that every candidate craved even if they wouldn't admit it. 55% success rate, which is higher than our historical average, and proof that the reforms we implemented have made the program more effective, not easier. He paused, and James recognized the setup, knew what was coming because they'd discussed it, because this moment had been planned and anticipated and prepared for. We have one more element to the ceremony. 3 years ago, an event occurred at this compound that changed everything. A candidate was targeted for elimination by corrupt evaluators, survived through skill and determination and absolute refusal to accept defeat, and in doing so exposed a system that needed to be burned down and rebuilt. That candidate is now an instructor here. And today, we're establishing an award in recognition of what she represents. Tommy gestured, and Elena stepped forward with a wooden plaque, simple and elegant, engraved with words that had been chosen carefully to mean something beyond the obvious. The Maddox Award for Exceptional Perseverance will be given annually to the candidate who best demonstrates the qualities we value most. Not the fastest or the strongest or the most skilled, but the one who shows the greatest heart, the most determination, the absolute refusal to quit when quitting makes sense. The candidate who proves that warrior isn't a physical description, it's a spiritual one. He turned to Jessica Torres, called her forward from formation. Candidate Torres, you are the first recipient of this award, not because you finished second in your class, but because you helped 5 other candidates complete evolutions they would have failed without your assistance. Because you put team success above personal glory. Because you understood that being an operator means making everyone around you better, not just proving you're the best. Jessica accepted the award with visible emotion, her hands shaking slightly as she held the plaque, as she read the inscription that included Ava's name and the date of her fight and a quote that Sarah Maddox had said years ago about strength being found in the people who lift others up rather than stand on them. The ceremony concluded, and candidates dispersed to celebrate or recover or begin planning their next steps. But Jessica approached Ava with the plaque held carefully, like it was more valuable than any medal she'd earned in combat. Ma'am, I need to tell you something. 5 years ago, I was ready to quit the Army. I'd been passed over for promotion twice because my evaluation said I was too aggressive, too masculine, not a good fit for the new integrated military. I was angry and bitter and convinced the system would never accept me. She looked down at the plaque, at Ava's name engraved in wood and metal. Then your video went viral. I watched you refuse to quit, watched you take punishment that should have broken you, watched your father trust you enough to let you fight your own battle. And I realized I'd been quitting before the fight even started, that I'd let other people's limitations become my own. I went back, reapplied for Ranger School, graduated top of my class, and spent the next 3 years proving that the evaluations were wrong, not me. Ava was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of what Jessica was saying, understanding for the first time the full scope of what her 8 minutes had created, the ripples that had spread far beyond her father's company or her own recovery. You did that yourself, Ava said finally. I just didn't quit on camera. You actually changed your life, did the work, became who you needed to be. That's harder, and it matters more. Maybe, Jessica replied, but I needed to see someone else do it first. Needed to know it was possible. That's what leaders do. They go first into the darkness so others know there's a path through it. After Jessica left, Elena appeared beside Ava with that particular expression that meant she had something to say and was trying to figure out how to say it. My sister would have liked her, Elena said quietly. Maria always believed the system would change if enough people refused to accept it the way it was. She just didn't live long enough to see it happen. I think about her sometimes, Ava admitted, about what it cost her to try to prove herself, about how different things might have been if the system had supported her instead of testing her to destruction. Things are different now, Elena said. Not perfect, not fixed, but different. That's because of what you did, what you survived. Maria's death wasn't meaningless if it helped create the change that prevented others from facing what she faced. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who appeared with his phone in an expression that was equal parts amusement and disbelief. You're not going to believe this. Pentagon just called. They want to use our program as the model for reform training standards across all private military contractors. Full federal funding, oversight board, the works. We'd be the gold standard. James felt something shift in his chest, some combination of pride and vindication, and the bittersweet understanding that being proven right didn't erase the cost of getting there. What's the catch? He asked, because there was always a catch. No catch. They're serious. They want what we built, want to scale it, want to make sure what happened here never happens anywhere else. It's everything we fought for, everything Ava bled for, being recognized and implemented. So we won, Ava said, and there was something complicated in her voice, some mixture of satisfaction and emptiness, the realization that winning sometimes felt less triumphant than you'd imagined it would. We survived, James corrected, and we learned, and we built something that matters. That's different than winning. That's better. The call came on a cold morning in December, 5 months after Hell Week, 3 days before Marcus Kovic's scheduled release from federal prison. James took it in his office, the room that still held Sarah's picture on the desk, and commendations from 35 years in Delta Force on the walls, and the weight of every decision he'd made that had led to this moment. Colonel Maddox, this is Marcus Kovic. I'm calling because I wanted you to hear this directly from me before I show up at your gate and make things awkward. James sat down, gestured for Tommy to stay, put the phone on speaker because whatever was coming needed witnesses. I'm listening. Marcus's voice came through the line different than James remembered, less aggressive, more considered, carrying the particular tone of someone who'd spent 5 years thinking about their choices and their consequences, and what it meant to be given a second chance you didn't deserve, but were grateful for anyway. I completed the rehabilitation programs, all of them, anger management, trauma counseling, restorative justice workshops. I've spent 5 years taking apart everything I thought I knew about strength and honor and what it means to be a warrior. And I've concluded that I was wrong about almost everything. He paused, and James heard something in the silence that might have been emotion, or might have been the sound of a man trying to find words for things he'd never learned to articulate. I was wrong about your daughter. She's not just capable. She's exceptional. She didn't succeed despite being a woman. She succeeded because she's an elite operateur who happens to be a woman. I was wrong about you. You weren't trying to destroy me 15 years ago. You were trying to save 3 soldiers' families from the lie I wanted to tell about how they died. And I was wrong about myself. I thought strength meant dominating others, proving superiority, never showing weakness. But watching your daughter fight while I tried to break her, I learned that real strength is refusing to break, refusing to let other people's hate become your identity, refusing to quit when quitting makes perfect sense. James was quiet for the long moment, letting the words settle, feeling the weight of them, the genuine remorse and understanding that only came from doing the hard work of actually changing, instead of just saying you'd changed. The offer stands, James said finally. You show up, you start as probationary instructor, you earn your place through work and integrity, and proving you meant what you just said. But Marcus, understand this. You're not coming here to find redemption. You're coming here to give back, to teach what you learned, to be part of something bigger than your own rehabilitation. Can you do that? I can try, Marcus replied. That's all I've got left to offer. The willingness to try to be better than I was. Then we'll see you in 3 days. And Marcus, thank you for calling. That took courage, and courage is what we need more of. The call ended, and Tommy let out a breath he'd been holding for the entire conversation. You really going to let him teach here? After everything? I'm going to give him the chance to prove he's changed, James corrected. Same chance I'd want if our positions were reversed. Same chance anyone deserves if they've actually done the work. Sarah taught me that holding grudges just poisons you from the inside. That mercy isn't weakness, it's strength. Ava proved it by surviving what Marcus tried to do to her. Now we get to prove it by helping him become something better than what he was. Marcus Kovic arrived at the compound on a gray December morning, dressed in civilian clothes that looked new and uncomfortable, carrying a single duffel bag that held everything he owned after 5 years in federal prison. He stood at the gate like he wasn't sure he had the right to enter, like he was waiting for permission or rejection. And James understood the feeling because he'd seen it in combat veterans who'd come home to find the civilian world didn't know what to do with people who'd been forged in fire. Ava met him at the gate, and the moment stretched out painful and electric and heavy with history. The last time they'd been in the same space, Marcus had been trying to beat her into submission, and she'd been fighting for her life, and her father had been watching, helpless from behind glass. Permission to enter, ma'am, Marcus said, and his voice carried genuine respect, genuine deference. The recognition that whatever power dynamic had existed before had been reversed completely. Granted, Ava replied, but understand something. You're here because my father believes in redemption, and I believe in second chances. But you hurt me. You tried to destroy me and my father and everything we built. That doesn't just disappear because you spent 5 years in prison and completed some programs. I know, Marcus said quietly. And I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or friendship or anything except the opportunity to do better, to teach what I learned the hard way so maybe someone else doesn't have to learn it through pain. Ava studied him for a long moment, and James watched from the observation deck, watched his daughter make the same kind of decision he'd been making for 35 years. Weighing risk against potential, judgment against mercy, the easy path against the right one. You'll start with basic instruction, Ava said finally, teaching fundamentals to new candidates, supervised by senior instructors, evaluated constantly. You prove yourself there, you move up. You backslide, you're done. No warnings, no second chances for the second chance. Clear? Crystal clear, ma'am. And stop calling me ma'am. I'm not your superior officer. I'm the woman whose life you tried to destroy. You want to be here, you acknowledge that every day. You own it, you carry it, and you use it to be better. Marcus nodded, and something in his expression shifted, some acceptance of burden that he'd been trying to avoid carrying, but couldn't anymore. I can do that, I can be that. And Ava, thank you for being tough enough to survive me and gracious enough to let me try to make amends. The months that followed were difficult in ways that went beyond physical training or operational planning. Marcus worked harder than anyone, arrived earlier and stayed later, and volunteered for every unpleasant duty, trying to prove through action what words couldn't convey. Some of the staff accepted him cautiously, recognizing genuine change when they saw it. Others remained skeptical, keeping distance, waiting for the inevitable failure or backslide. But Marcus didn't fail. He taught hand-to-hand combat with a focus on restraint and control, emphasizing that real warriors knew when not to fight just as much as how to fight. He shared his story with candidates, the mistakes he'd made and the price he'd paid, and the lessons that had come from sitting in a cell for 5 years, thinking about the difference between what he'd done and what he'd become. And slowly, incrementally, he earned a place. Not redemption because some things couldn't be redeemed, only learned from, but purpose. The chance to be part of something that built people up instead of tearing them down. On a spring morning 6 months after Marcus's arrival, James stood in the observation deck, watching him teach a group of candidates basic defensive tactics. Ava appeared beside him, and together they watched the man who'd once tried to destroy their family, now helping shape the next generation of operators. "You think he's really changed?" Ava asked. "Or are we just hoping he has because we want to believe people can be better?" "Both," James replied. "He's changed. I see it every day in the way he teaches and interacts and carries himself. But we're also choosing to believe because the alternative is accepting that people are fixed, that mistakes are permanent, that there's no path from who you were to who you might become. And I can't accept that. Your mother wouldn't have accepted that. So we choose to believe, and we verify through observation, and we adjust if we're wrong." Ava was quiet for a moment, watching Marcus demonstrate a technique with patience and precision, correcting a candidate's form with encouragement instead of criticism. "I forgave him," she said finally, "not because he deserved it or earned it or because enough time passed, because carrying that anger was like drinking poison and expecting him to die. Mom taught us that, right? That the only person hate hurts is the person holding it." "She did," James confirmed. "Took me 30 years to understand what she meant. Took you less than 5. That's how I know you're smarter than I ever was." The years continued to pass, each one adding layers of legitimacy and success to what they'd built. The compound trained over 300 operators in the reform program, with success rates that exceeded industry standards and washout rates that reflected genuine inability rather than systematic elimination. The Maddox Award became prestigious enough that candidates competed for it with the same intensity they'd once reserved for just completing Hell Week. Jessica Torres went on to establish her own training facility focused on female operators, using principles she'd learned at the compound and adding her own innovations. She called it Torres Tactical, and Ava served on the advisory board, providing guidance and support and the credibility that came from having survived what everyone else just talked about. Elena eventually left to work with the FBI full-time, training agents in tactical operations and cultural competency and how to recognize the signs of institutional corruption before it escalated to violence. But she came back twice a year to teach guest seminars, and she always spent extra time with the female candidates, sharing her sister's story and making sure Maria's death contributed to the change they'd all fought for. Marcus became a permanent instructor after 2 years of probationary status, respected by students and staff alike for his technical expertise and his willingness to be vulnerable about his failures. He never forgot what he'd done, never stopped acknowledging it, but he also didn't let it define him. He became proof that people could change if they did the work, if they accepted responsibility, if they were given the opportunity and support to become something better. And James, watching all of this unfold from his observation deck and his office, and his quiet moments alone with Sarah's picture, finally understood what legacy actually meant. Not the company or the contracts or the reputation, though those mattered, but the people. The lives changed, the standards raised. The next generation taught not just how to fight, but why to fight and what was worth fighting for. On a November morning, 7 years after Ava's 8 minutes had become the video that changed everything, James stood at Sarah's grave with flowers in his hand and words in his heart that he'd been trying to find for years. "I kept my promise," he said to the headstone that marked where his wife rested beneath Montana soil. "Let her fly," you said. "Let her fall. Let her learn. But always let her know you're proud. I did all of that, even when it terrified me. And you were right. Like you were right about everything else. She didn't need me to protect her. She needed me to trust her. And once I figured that out, everything else made sense." He knelt beside the grave, touched the stone with fingers that had held rifles and signed contracts, and cradled their daughter when she was born 28 years ago. "The company's doing good, better than good. We're training people the right way now, the way you would have wanted. Ava's teaching, and she's better at it than I ever was. Marcus is here, working to make amends, proving that your belief in redemption wasn't naive, it was wise. And I'm finally at peace with all of it. The choices I made, the prices we paid, the legacy we're building. I'm at peace. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and the particular clarity that came with high altitude and thin air. And James imagined he heard Sarah's voice one more time, saying what she'd always said when he'd done something right. I'm proud of you too, baby. The compound's 10th anniversary celebration was scheduled for a Saturday in December. 10 years after that first viral video, 7 years after the reforms, countless changed lives later. Candidates and graduates and instructors and staff gathered in the training facility that had been transformed for the occasion. Banners and displays showing the evolution of the program and the people it had produced. Ava stood at the podium, 31 years old now, carrying the scars and wisdom that only came from being forged in fire and choosing to use that experience to light the way for others. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the facility, my father built a program designed to identify elite operators. He did it with the best intentions and the highest standards and the absolute conviction that excellence mattered more than politics. He was right about all of that, but he also made mistakes, the same mistakes a lot of good people make. He tried to control outcomes, protect people from failure, ensure success through interference instead of trust. She looked at her father sitting in the front row between Tommy and Elena and Marcus, and her expression was love mixed with understanding, mixed with the particular gratitude that came from being given the space to become yourself. I forced him to confront those mistakes by refusing to quit when quitting made sense. And in doing so, we both learned something that matters more than any technique or protocol or training evolution. We learned that legacy isn't what you build for yourself. It's what you build into other people. It's the lives you change, the standards you raise, the example you set when you think nobody's watching. She gestured to the crowd, to the hundreds of operators and candidates and supporters who'd gathered to celebrate a decade of transformation. Every person in this room is part of a legacy that started long before I stepped onto that mat 7 years ago. My father's legacy of service and sacrifice. My mother's legacy of compassion and wisdom. The legacy of every operator who came before us and proved that excellence transcends demographics. And the legacy we're building together, right now, by choosing to be better than the system that tried to break us. The applause was long and genuine, and James felt something release in his chest that he'd been holding since the day Sarah died. Some last piece of grief and guilt and fear that finally loosened his grip and let him breathe fully for the first time in a decade. After the ceremony, after the speeches and awards and celebrations, James found himself alone in the observation deck, looking out at the compound in the gathering darkness. Montana winter was coming, snow already dusting the peaks, temperature dropping toward the kind of cold that tested everything and revealed what was genuine versus what was just performance. Ava found him there, brought him coffee because some traditions mattered, stood beside him in comfortable silence while they watched lights come on across the facility. You did good, Dad, she said finally. Built something that matters, something that'll outlive both of us. That's what Mom wanted for you. Not just success, but significance. Not just achievement, but impact. I had help, James replied. From you, from Tommy, from everyone who believed this mattered enough to fight for it, but mostly from your mother. She taught me the last lesson, the one I'd been missing for 35 years. That strength isn't about control, it's about trust. That legacy isn't about what you hold on to, it's about what you let go. They stood in silence for a moment, father and daughter, watching the compound that had been built with Sarah's wisdom and James's sacrifice and Ava's refusal to quit. Watching the lights that represented lives being changed and futures being forged in the kind of legacy that actually mattered. She'd be proud of us, Ava said quietly. She is proud of us, James corrected. Wherever she is, whatever comes after, she's watching and she's proud. Because we kept our promises. We let you fly. We let you fall. We let you learn. And we made sure you always knew we were proud. The Montana night settled over the compound like a blanket woven from starlight in memory. And in that darkness, James Maddox finally found the peace he'd been searching for since the day his wife died and left him with a promise he didn't understand and a daughter who would teach him what it meant. The last lesson was complete. The legacy was secured. And what remained was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when everything was counted and weighed and measured, They'd done more good than harm, built more than they'd broken, and left the world slightly better than they'd found it. For a warrior who'd spent 35 years in the world's darkest places, that was enough. That was everything. That was the only victory that mattered. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to human suffering and triumph, and James Maddox watched them with the understanding that some things transcended individual lives, that legacy was measured in generations rather than years, and that the last lesson his wife had taught him would echo forward through time in the lives of every person who learned that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about always getting back up, always moving forward, always refusing to let the darkness define you, always choosing to be better than the worst thing that ever happened to you. The last lesson, the only lesson that mattered, the one that would outlive them all. As a father myself, filming this story hit me harder than any combat footage I've covered. That moment when Colonel Maddox pressed his hand against the glass, watching his daughter fight for her life while every instinct screamed to intervene. That's every parent's nightmare. But it's also the hardest lesson we face, trusting the people we love to fight their own battles. What would you have done in his position? Stopped the fight and protected her? Or trusted her training like he did? Drop your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, there are more untold military stories waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss them.